Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, a quiet little place where curiosity gets comfortable and science takes the long, gentle road instead of the busy highway. Wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, whether you are curled up under a blanket, leaning back in a chair, or staring softly at a ceiling that has seen many thoughtful moments before, I am glad you are here. This evening we are stepping into a time so distant that even the oldest mountains on our planet would have seemed young, a stretch of Earth story known as the Mesozoic, when life moved to a very different rhythm and the world itself wore a face you might barely recognise. Before we wander too far into that deep past, let me ask you something simple and personal. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late evening, with the day finally loosening its grip, or perhaps early morning, when the light feels like a quiet promise instead of a demand? And where in the world are you listening from, in the shared moment that somehow bridges millions of years and countless miles with just a voice and a thought? If you find this little journey soothing or interesting, or if it simply gives you a gentle place to rest your mind for a while, you might consider giving the video a like or subscribing. It helps this calm corner of the internet reach other travellers who might be looking for something soft and steady at the end of a long day. Now, let's begin easing backward. Not in a rush, not with a dramatic leap, but with the slow, steady pace of someone walking into a familiar room that just happens to be filled with unfamiliar furniture. The Mesozoic era stretches across an almost unimaginable span of time, from about 252 million years ago to roughly 66 million years ago. To put that into a scale that feels more human, if all of Earth's 4.5 billion years were compressed into a single calendar year, the Mesozoic would begin around mid-December and end just a few days before New Year's Eve. It is both a brief moment in the planet's life and an entire world of its own, packed with stories, landscapes, and living things that shaped everything we see around us today. At the very start of this era, the planet was recovering from something truly catastrophic. The event that marked the boundary between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic was the largest mass extinction Earth has ever experienced. Scientists estimate that up to 90% of all species disappeared. Oceans were nearly emptied of many forms of life, forests were stripped back, and entire ecosystems were erased. If Earth had a memory, this would have been one of its darkest chapters. But life, in its persistent, almost stubborn way, does not stay gone for long. Slowly, quietly, it began to fill in the empty spaces. Picture the world at this time. All the continents were locked together in a massive supercontinent called Pangaea. Instead of separate oceans dividing lands, there was a single, vast landmass stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a global ocean known as Panthalassa. The interior of this supercontinent was harsh and dry, far from the moderating influence of the sea. Deserts sprawled across wide regions and temperatures swung between extremes. Along the edges, near the coasts, life found more comfortable conditions, with rivers, wetlands, and forests creating places where plants and animals could settle and spread. If you were somehow able to stand there in the early days of the Mesozoic, the air itself would feel different. Oxygen levels were not quite what they are today, and carbon dioxide was much higher. The sky would still be blue, clouds would still gather and break into rain, but the world beneath would look unfamiliar. There was no grass, none at all. Lawns, fields, meadows, and rolling prairies simply did not exist yet. Instead, the ground was covered by ferns, cycads, conifers, and other ancient plant groups that had been around long before flowering plants ever appeared. Walking through one of these forests would feel like stepping into a living museum. Tree ferns with thick, rough trunks would tower above you, their fronds spreading out like green umbrellas. Cycads, which look a bit like squat palm trees with stiff, spiky leaves, would dot the landscape. Conifers, relatives of modern pines and firs, would rise in straight, narrow forms, their needles whispering softly in the wind. The scent in the air might be sharp and resinous, especially near the conifers, mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil and decaying plant matter. This is the setting in which some of the most famous creatures in Earth's history began their long reign. Dinosaurs did not appear suddenly as towering giants. In their earliest forms, they were relatively small, agile animals, sharing the land with many other reptiles, including crocodile-like creatures, early relatives of mammals, and a variety of lizards and amphibians. Over millions of years, through gradual changes and quiet evolutionary experiments, dinosaurs began to diversify and grow into a wide range of shapes and sizes. You might imagine the Mesozoic as a world constantly shaking with the footsteps of massive creatures, but much of life happened at a smaller scale. Tiny insects buzzed and crawled through the undergrowth. Early mammals, no larger than rats or squirrels, scurried in the shadows, mostly active at night to avoid the dominant reptiles of the day. Frogs and salamanders lingered near water, much as they do now, their ancient body plans already well suited to their environments. Time in this world moves slowly, at least from a human perspective. Rivers carved their paths through rock over thousands of years. Mountains rose and wore down over millions. Continents, which seemed fixed and immovable, were actually drifting apart at the pace your fingernails grow. The great landmass of Pangaea was beginning to crack and split, pulled apart by the slow, relentless motion of tectonic plates. These movements would eventually give rise to the familiar shapes of today's continents, but in the Mesozoic, the process was just getting underway. As the land shifted, so did the climate. Warm, shallow seas flooded across low-lying areas, creating broad coastal plains and inland waterways. These environments were especially rich in life. Coral reefs grew in clear, sunlit waters, providing shelter for fish, mollusks, and countless other marine creatures. On land, changing rainfall patterns created lush regions where plants could thrive, which in turn supported larger and more diverse animal communities. One of the most striking differences between the Mesozoic world and our own is the absence of familiar sounds. There were no birds singing in the trees during the early parts of this era, because birds had not yet evolved. Instead, the air would have been filled with the rustling of leaves, the chirring and buzzing of insects, and the calls of reptiles whose voices we can only guess at today. The oceans, too, held their own symphony, with the movement of water, the snap of shells, and the distant motions of large marine animals gliding through the depths. Life during the Mesozoic was deeply connected to the rhythms of the planet. Day and night cycles still followed the steady spin of Earth, and seasons came and went as the planet tilted toward and away from the sun. Without artificial light, nights would have been truly dark, illuminated only by the moon and the stars. Animals that were active after sunset would rely on keen senses of smell, hearing, and touch, rather than sight, moving carefully through a world of shadows and faint outlines. It is also worth remembering that the Mesozoic was not a single, unchanging block of time. It is divided into three long periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Each of these had its own character, its own shifts in climate, geography, and life. The world at the beginning of the Triassic looked very different from the world at the end of the Cretaceous, even though both fall under the same broad label. Over these millions of years, dinosaurs rose from minor players to dominant forces, flowering plants appeared and spread, birds took to the skies, and mammals began to carve out new roles in the ecosystem. If you try to imagine a single day in the middle of this era, it might begin with a warm, hazy sunrise over a forest of conifers and cycads. Mist would lift from nearby rivers, and the ground would still be cool from the night. Small animals would emerge from burrows and hiding places, foraging for food before larger, more dangerous creatures became active. Somewhere in the distance you might hear the low, resonant call of a large dinosaur, a sound that carries across the landscape and fades into the background like distant thunder. As the sun climbed higher, the air would grow warmer, insects would become more active, and plant life would soak up the light, fueling the slow, steady process of growth that underpins every food chain. Herbivorous dinosaurs would move in groups, browsing on leaves and branches, while predators watched from a distance, choosing their moments carefully. In the rivers and lakes, fish would dart through the water, and larger reptiles might lurk near the surface, waiting for an opportunity. Evening would bring a gradual cooling. Shadows would stretch across the ground, and the colours of the world would soften. The dominant daytime animals would settle down, while nocturnal creatures began their own rounds. Early mammals, with their warm-blooded bodies and sensitive whiskers, would take advantage of the quieter hours, searching for insects, seeds, and small prey. Above them, the stars would wheel slowly across the sky, just as they do now, a reminder that even as life on Earth changes, the broader universe keeps its steady pace. What makes the Mesozoic so fascinating is not just the presence of famous creatures, but the way entire systems of life were built, tested, and reshaped. Plants and animals were constantly responding to changes in climate, geography, and each other. When one group became more successful, others had to adapt or find new ways to survive. This ongoing exchange is what drove the incredible diversity of forms that appeared over time. Take, for example, the relationship between plants and the animals that ate them. Early in the Mesozoic, most plants reproduced using spores or simple seeds, and herbivores adapted to feed on tough fibrous leaves. Later, when flowering plants began to appear, they brought with them new kinds of fruits and seeds, which in turn encouraged the evolution of animals that could spread those seeds to new locations. This quiet partnership between plants and animals would eventually shape the landscapes we know today, from forests to fields. The oceans followed their own parallel story. Marine reptiles such as ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs evolved streamlined bodies that allowed them to move efficiently through water, much like modern dolphins and whales. Coral reefs expanded and contracted with changes in sea level and temperature. Microscopic organisms in the plankton formed the base of complex food webs, supporting everything from small fish to massive predators. Through all of this, the planet itself remained an active participant. Volcanoes erupted, releasing gases that altered the climate. Asteroids occasionally struck, leaving scars in the form of craters and disturbed ecosystems. Sea levels rose and fell as ice formed and melted at the poles, even in a generally warmer world. None of these processes happened in isolation. Each one rippled outward, influencing life in ways that might not become obvious for thousands or even millions of years. It can be comforting, in a quiet way, to think about how life persisted through all of this change. Species came and went, landscapes shifted and climates transformed, yet the basic pattern of living, growing and adapting continued. The Mesozoic is often remembered for how it ended, with a dramatic event that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, but it is just as much a story of beginnings. Many of the groups that define the modern world, including birds, flowering plants and mammals, trace their roots back to this era. The Mesozoic was not just a stage for dramatic scenes and towering figures. It was a living, working world, filled with small moments as well as grand ones. Leaves unfurled in the morning light, water flowed around stones in shallow streams, creatures found food, avoided danger, and rested when the day was done. In many ways, it was a world not so different from our own, even if the cast of characters and the shape of the land were unfamiliar. Long before familiar coastlines traced the edges of maps, and before any human eyes ever scanned a horizon for signs of home, the planet itself was still finding its balance, like a traveller adjusting their footing after stepping off a long, uncertain journey. The Mesozoic morning, if you could call it that, did not arrive with the sound of alarm clocks or the soft glow of streetlights. It unfolded instead with the slow brightening of a sky over landscapes that felt both raw and quietly patient, as if the Earth were still trying on different versions of itself to see which one fit best. Imagine standing on solid ground that has only recently recovered from profound loss. The great extinction that closed the door on the earlier era left behind a world that was in many ways open and waiting. Forests were thinner, oceans were quieter, and the complex webs of life that had once filled every corner were only beginning to reweave themselves. The air carried a kind of emptiness that would not last forever, but in those early moments, it was part of the character of the place, like the calm that follows a powerful storm. The land beneath your feet would feel different from what you know today. Soils were still developing, shaped by wind, rain, and the slow breakdown of rock rather than by deep-rooted plants and rich layers of organic matter. In some regions, the ground would be sandy and dry, especially far from the coasts, where the massive supercontinent of Pangaea stretched wide and unbroken. Inland areas often faced harsh conditions, with little rain and long stretches of heat that baked the surface into hard, cracked patterns. Closer to the edges of the land, however, the story changed. Rivers wound their way toward the great surrounding ocean, carrying sediment and nutrients that fed growing ecosystems. Here, you would find greener spaces, patches of forest, and wetlands that acted as gathering places for many forms of life. The contrast between these regions was sharp, a reminder that even in deep time, geography played a powerful role in shaping who lived where and how they survived. The sky overhead would offer familiar comforts. The sun rose and set as it always has, and clouds drifted across the blue, sometimes gathering into storms that swept over the land. Rain fell in sheets or gentle drops depending on the season and the region. Lightning cracked through the air, and thunder rolled across open plains. These elements, so recognizable to us, connected this ancient world to our own in a way that feels almost reassuring. Yet the air itself would carry a different weight. Carbon dioxide levels were higher, and the overall climate leaned warmer than what most of us experience today. Polar ice was limited or absent for long stretches of this era, and temperatures across much of the planet stayed relatively mild, even at higher latitudes. This warmth allowed forests to grow closer to the poles and helped create a more even distribution of life across the globe. If you took a slow walk through one of the forests that did exist at this time, you would notice how unfamiliar the plant life looked. There were no flowering plants yet, no colourful petals or sweet-smelling blooms. Instead, the greenery was dominated by ferns, cycads, ginkgos and conifers. Leaves tended to be tough and leathery, built to withstand heat and dryness rather than to attract pollinators that had not yet evolved. Ferns spread their fronds in wide, feathery patterns, often covering the forest floor in thick green layers. Cycads stood like sturdy sentinels, their crowns of stiff leaves radiating outward from thick, squat trunks. Conifers reached upward, their narrow needles and tall forms creating a canopy that filtered sunlight into soft, shifting patterns below. Ginkgo trees, ancestors of a species that still survives today, added their distinctive fan-shaped leaves to the mix, a small but meaningful link between that ancient world and the present. The forest floor itself was a busy place, even if much of the activity stayed close to the ground. Insects crawled, flew, and buzzed among fallen leaves and decaying wood. Beetles, early flies, and other small creatures played essential roles in breaking down plant matter and recycling nutrients back into the soil. Their work, quiet and constant, helped support the growth of new plants, and by extension the animals that depended on those plants for food. Not far from these forests, open areas stretched out into plains and deserts that could feel almost empty at first glance. Low-growing plants clung to life in sandy soil, and patches of greenery appeared near water sources like oases in a dry sea. These spaces might seem harsh, but they too were home to creatures adapted to survive in conditions that demanded efficiency and resilience. Reptiles were especially well suited to this world. Their scaly skin helped reduce water loss, and their ability to regulate body temperature through behaviour rather than constant internal heat production made them efficient users of energy. Early dinosaurs were part of this broader group of reptiles, sharing the land with many others that would eventually fade into obscurity as the era progressed. At this stage, dinosaurs were not yet the undisputed rulers of the land. They were one group among many, competing for space and resources with crocodile-like predators, large amphibians, and various reptilian herbivores. The balance of power shifted gradually, influenced by changes in climate, vegetation, and the ongoing movement of the continents. If you followed a river from its source in higher ground down toward the sea, you would pass through a series of environments, each with its own character. Upstream, the water might run fast and clear, cutting through rocky channels and feeding small pools where amphibians and fish found shelter. Further down, the river would widen and slow, creating floodplains where sediment built up rich, fertile soil. These areas supported denser plant growth and attracted a wider variety of animals. The riverbanks would be lively places, especially during certain times of day. Herbivores came to drink, and predators watched from cover, choosing their moments carefully. Smaller animals darted in and out of the undergrowth, always alert for signs of danger. The water itself carried life in the form of fish, invertebrates, and aquatic plants, forming a parallel world that mirrored the complexity of the land above. Beyond the shoreline, the great ocean stretched out, covering most of the planet's surface. The sea during the Mesozoic was warm and rich in nutrients, especially in shallow coastal areas where sunlight could penetrate easily. These regions supported vast communities of plankton, which formed the foundation of marine food webs. Tiny organisms drifting with the currents fed larger creatures, which in turn supported even bigger predators. Coral reefs, built by small, hard-working animals over countless generations, created complex underwater landscapes. These reefs offered shelter and food for fish, mollusks, and early marine reptiles. Swimming through one of these environments would reveal a world of movement and colour, even without the bright flowers and grasses that define many modern ecosystems. Marine reptiles, such as early ichthyosaurs, move through the water with sleek, streamlined bodies. Their shapes, remarkably similar to modern dolphins and whales, showed how certain solutions to life in water tend to appear again and again in evolution. These animals breathed air, just like land-dwelling creatures, and had to return to the surface regularly, creating brief, visible moments of connection between the underwater world and the open sky. Back on land, the cycle of day and night shaped daily routines. Without artificial light, darkness brought a true end to visibility. When the sun set, the world shifted into a quieter mode. Temperatures dropped, and many daytime animals sought shelter. Nocturnal creatures emerged, taking advantage of cooler air and reduced competition. Early mammals, small and often overlooked in popular imagination, played important roles during these hours. Their fur helped keep them warm, and their sharp senses allowed them to navigate in low light. They foraged for insects, seeds, and small prey, contributing to the spread of plants and the control of insect populations. In their own quiet way, they were laying the groundwork for a future that would not fully arrive until long after the Mesozoic came to an end. Weather patterns added another layer of movement to this world. Seasonal rains could transform dry plains into temporary wetlands, creating bursts of plant growth that attracted animals from far and wide. Droughts, on the other hand, forced creatures to travel in search of water, reshaping migration routes and altering local ecosystems. These changes, repeated over thousands of years, left their marks in the rocks, creating layers that scientists now read like pages in a very old book. Volcanoes also played their part. In some regions, the Earth's crust was thinner and more active, allowing magma to reach the surface. Eruptions released ash and gases into the atmosphere, sometimes cooling the climate temporarily or enriching the soil with new minerals. While destructive in the short term, these events often created opportunities for new life to take hold in the long run. As the continents slowly began to pull apart, new coastlines formed. Shallow seas flooded into low-lying areas, creating inland waterways that connected distant regions. These corridors allowed plants and animals to spread into new territories, mixing populations and driving further evolutionary change. The world became more fragmented but also more diverse, with different regions developing their own distinct communities. This process of separation and connection happened at a pace almost too slow to notice, yet its effects were profound. Over millions of years, what began as small cracks in a single landmass turned into the wide oceans that now divide continents. The Mesozoic morning was, in this sense, also a morning for the modern world, setting the stage for the familiar arrangement of land and sea. It is easy to focus on the large and dramatic when thinking about this era, but much of its character came from ordinary repeating moments: a plant growing toward the light, an animal finding a safe place to rest, a stream changing course after a heavy rain. These small events, multiplied across vast spans of time and space, shaped the overall direction of life on Earth. The concept of a younger and wilder planet does not mean chaos without structure. There were patterns, rhythms, and relationships, even if they looked different from what we see now. Predator and prey, growth and decay, movement and rest, all played out in ways that maintained a kind of balance, even as the details shifted from place to place and era to era. If you paused long enough in one spot, you might start to notice these rhythms: morning activity giving way to midday stillness, the return of movement as the heat of the day softened, the subtle changes in light as clouds passed overhead, the steady presence of wind carrying seeds, scents and sounds from one place to another. Overhead, the stars traced familiar paths across the night sky. Constellations were not exactly the same as those we recognize today, because the slow motion of stars across the galaxy changes their patterns over time. Still, the idea of looking up and seeing points of light scattered across darkness would have been a shared experience across millions of years. Life during this time did not know it was living in what humans would one day call the Mesozoic. It simply followed the rules set by its environment: find food, avoid danger, reproduce, rest. These simple instructions, carried out in countless variations, produced the rich tapestry of forms and behaviours that fill the fossil record. The land itself kept a kind of memory. Footprints pressed into soft mud hardened into stone. Fallen trees were buried by sediment and slowly turned into fossils. Shells, bones and leaves left behind traces that, much later, would tell stories to those who learned how to read them. Every step, every growth ring in a tree, every ripple in a layer of sand became part of a long archive of the planet's history. As you let this picture settle, it might feel less like looking at a distant alien world and more like visiting a place that operates on the same basic principles as our own, just with different players and a slower, broader sense of time. The Mesozoic morning was not a single sunrise, but a prolonged beginning, a phase in which the Earth explored new ways of being alive. From this foundation, life would continue to branch out, filling niches, testing limits, and responding to changes both gradual and sudden. The giants of later periods, the flowering plants that would eventually colour the land, and the birds that would take to the air, all had their roots in this earlier, quieter world. If you let your attention drift just a little farther into this ancient world, past the first sense of arrival and into the everyday spaces where life actually unfolded, you begin to notice something quietly striking. There are no open fields of waving grass. There are no stone walls, no roads, no signs that anything has ever tried to settle, organise or claim a piece of land as its own. The planet stretches out in a way that feels unclaimed and unmarked, shaped only by water, wind, and the slow movements of the earth beneath it. This is a world built from plants that grow in clusters and canopies rather than carpets, and from seas that reach far inland, turning coastlines into wide, shallow spaces where land and water blur into each other. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a forest that looks both dense and open at the same time. The ground is not covered in a soft, even layer of green the way modern grasslands are. Instead, it is textured and varied. Ferns spread across the lower levels, their fronds arching outward in overlapping layers, some no taller than your knees, others rising well above your head like living umbrellas. Each frond is made up of many smaller leaflets, giving the whole plant a delicate feathered look, even though the stems and roots beneath are sturdy and well anchored in the soil. Between the ferns, patches of bare ground appear, mixed with fallen leaves, decaying wood, and the occasional smooth stone carried there by rain or stream. The surface feels uneven underfoot, shaped by roots pushing up from below and by small channels carved by flowing water. There is a sense that the land is always in the middle of becoming something else, never quite finished, never truly settled. Above the ferns, the next layer of the forest rises. Cycads stand in scattered groups, their thick trunks topped with crowns of stiff, spiky leaves that radiate outward in circular patterns. They look almost like sculptures placed deliberately in the landscape, even though they grow entirely on their own terms. Their leaves are tough and leathery, built to resist drying out in a warm climate and to discourage animals from feeding on them too eagerly. Conifers form another part of the canopy, their tall, straight trunks lifting branches high into the air. Their needles create a softer, more filtered light below, casting shifting patterns of shade that move as the wind passes through. Resin sometimes oozes from their bark, carrying a sharp, clean scent that mixes with the earthy smell of damp soil and decaying plant matter. Every so often, a ginkgo tree adds a different shape to the scene. Its fan-shaped leaves flutter more freely in the breeze, catching the light in a way that feels almost playful. This tree, or rather its ancient relatives, has been around for an incredibly long time, and seeing it here gives the sense of a quiet continuity that stretches from this deep past all the way to the present day. There are no flowers in this world yet, no bright colours designed to attract bees or butterflies. Pollination happens through wind and water, not through partnerships with insects. As a result, the overall palette of the landscape leans heavily toward greens and browns, with the occasional variation in the shade of bark, the colour of soil, or the reflective surface of water. The air within this forest carries sound differently than in a modern woodland. Without birds calling from branch to branch, the dominant noises come from insects, the rustling of leaves, and the movement of animals through the undergrowth. The hum of wings, the soft scrape of feet on soil, and the distant splash of something entering a stream create a kind of low, constant background that fills the space without overwhelming it. If you follow a path, whether carved by flowing water or by the repeated passage of animals, it might lead you toward one of the many waterways that shape this world. Rivers here are not confined by artificial banks or guided by human engineering. They wander, they split and rejoin, they flood their surroundings during heavy rains and retreat during drier seasons, leaving behind new layers of sediment that slowly change the shape of the land. At the edges of these rivers, the vegetation grows thicker, ferns reach higher, and trees cluster closer together, drawn by the reliable supply of water. The ground becomes softer, sometimes muddy, marked by the impressions of feet, claws and tails that have passed through recently. These marks do not last forever. A single strong rain can blur them into nothing, but for a short time they tell quiet stories of movement and presence. As the river continues its journey, it eventually meets the sea, but not in a sharp, clearly defined line. Instead, the coastline spreads out into wide, shallow areas where fresh and salt water mix. These regions, often called coastal plains or shallow seas, form some of the most productive environments in this ancient world. Here, the water is warm and often clear enough for sunlight to reach the bottom. This light fuels the growth of algae and other simple plants, which form the base of a complex food web. Small creatures feed on these plants, larger ones feed on them, and so on, creating layers of life that extend from the surface down into the sediment below. If you were able to look beneath the water surface, you would see a busy scene. Schools of fish move together in shifting patterns, changing direction as if guided by a single shared thought. Shellfish cling to rocks and burrow into the sand. Crabs and other crustaceans scuttle across the bottom, leaving tracks that are soon erased by the gentle movement of water. Coral-like organisms build up structures over long periods, creating reefs that rise from the sea floor. These reefs are not just solid walls of stone. They are living systems built by countless tiny animals that secrete hard skeletons and grow on top of each other generation after generation. The result is a complex three-dimensional environment full of holes, ledges and hidden spaces where many creatures find shelter. Above and around these reefs, larger animals glide through the water. Some of them are marine reptiles, air-breathing creatures that have returned to the sea after evolving on land. Their bodies are shaped for efficient swimming, with strong tails and streamlined forms that cut through the water with ease. They move with a calm, steady motion, surfacing occasionally to take a breath before slipping back into the depths. The boundary between land and sea in these areas is not fixed. Tides rise and fall, exposing wide stretches of wet sand and shallow pools. These temporary spaces become gathering points for animals that feed on small fish, shellfish, and other creatures left behind by the retreating water. Birds have not yet evolved to take advantage of this opportunity, but other animals fill similar roles, moving in and out with the rhythm of the tides. Further inland, beyond the reach of the sea, lakes and wetlands create their own distinct landscapes. Water collects in low-lying areas, forming broad, shallow basins that support thick growths of plants along their edges. These wetlands act as filters, trapping sediment and nutrients, and providing habitat for a wide range of organisms. Amphibians thrive in these environments, laying their eggs in the water and moving between land and sea as part of their life cycles. Insects gather in large numbers, drawn by the moisture and the abundance of plant life. Fish and other aquatic animals find refuge in the deeper parts of these lakes, while predators patrol the edges, watching for movement. The land surrounding these water bodies often shows signs of constant change. During wet seasons, the area may be flooded, turning forest floor into temporary waterways. When the water recedes, it leaves behind new layers of soil that support fresh growth. This cycle of flooding and drying creates a patchwork of habitats, each suited to different kinds of plants and animals. If you travel far enough, you might come to regions where water is scarce. Deserts and dry plains stretch out under a wide open sky. Here the vegetation is sparse, and the ground is often hard and cracked. Life in these areas is adapted to make the most of limited resources. Plants have thick leaves or deep roots, and animals are active during cooler parts of the day or night to avoid the heat. These dry regions are not lifeless, but they feel quieter, more spread out. Movement is less constant, and the signs of life are subtler. A small lizard might dart between rocks. A distant animal might kick up a faint cloud of dust as it moves across the plain. The wind becomes a more noticeable presence, shaping the surface of the land and carrying seeds and spores from one place to another. Throughout all of these landscapes, the absence of grass changes the way the world feels. Grass in the modern world forms continuous soft layers that invite animals to graze and humans to sit or walk easily. In the Mesozoic, the ground is more uneven and more varied. Every step might bring you onto a different surface, from soft leaf litter to exposed stone to damp, muddy soil. This variety influences how animals move and feed. Large herbivores do not lower their heads to crop short plants from the ground. Instead, they reach up or out, pulling leaves from branches or stripping fronds from tall ferns. Their bodies and necks evolve in response to this style of feeding, shaping the forms that become so familiar in the fossil record. Predators, in turn, adapt to these environments. Some rely on speed and open spaces, chasing prey across plains or along riverbanks. Others use cover, moving quietly through forests and undergrowth, waiting for the right moment to strike. The structure of the landscape influences every aspect of these interactions, from where animals sleep to how they raise their young. The lack of cities or permanent structures means that nothing in this world is built to last beyond the lifespan of the creatures that use it. Nests are temporary. Burrows may be reused for a time, but eventually they collapse or fill in. Paths shift as rivers change course or vegetation grows back. The land does not remember in the same way a human-built environment does. Its memory is written in layers of sediment and stone rather than in walls and roads. This gives the entire planet a sense of ongoing motion, even in moments of stillness. A fallen tree begins to decay almost immediately, providing food for insects and fungi. Over time, it becomes part of the soil that supports new plants. A dried-up pool leaves behind a cracked surface that will soften and fill again with the next heavy rain. Nothing stays exactly the same for very long. The sky plays its part in shaping these landscapes. Clouds gather and disperse, casting moving shadows across forests and water. Storms roll in from the sea, bringing bursts of rain that refresh the land and reshape the edges of rivers and lakes. The sun, strong in a generally warmer climate, drives evaporation and growth, linking the movement of water in the air to the movement of life on the ground. Even the position of the continents influences the patterns of wind and rain. With large land masses joined together, air currents behave differently than they do in the modern world. Some regions receive regular moisture, while others remain dry for long stretches. These patterns shift slowly over time as the continents continue their gradual separation. It can be helpful to think of this world as a series of connected systems rather than a collection of isolated places. What happens in the ocean affects the land, and what happens on the land eventually finds its way back to the sea. Rivers carry minerals and organic matter downstream. Coastal storms push salt water inland. Plants draw nutrients from the soil and return them when they die and decay. Animals move between these systems, carrying seeds in their digestive tracts or on their bodies. Predators control the numbers of herbivores, which in turn influence the growth of plants. Even the smallest organisms like bacteria and fungi play essential roles in breaking down dead material and recycling it into forms that living things can use again. This network of relationships gives the Mesozoic world a kind of quiet resilience. While individual species may come and go, the overall pattern of life continues, adjusting to new conditions and new players. Landscapes change, but they do not become empty. They transform, making room for different forms of living. The absence of grass and cities is not a lack, but a reminder of how many different versions of Earth have existed, each with its own logic and its own ways of supporting life. This planet, in this era, is not waiting for humans. It is complete in itself, full of interactions and rhythms that do not need an audience to be meaningful. Yet here you are, far removed in time, able to imagine these places and connect with them through the traces they left behind. And as the light shifts across these ancient landscapes, and the shallow seas continue their gentle movements against the edges of the land, the living world within them keeps adapting, growing, and exploring new possibilities, carrying the story forward into forms and patterns that will soon begin to feel both familiar and entirely new. Across the wide stretches of land that once lay under unfamiliar skies, something subtle began to shift long before any creature grew large enough to cast a shadow that stretched across a riverbank. The change did not arrive with a single dramatic moment or a clear dividing line. Instead, it unfolded quietly, through small advantages, slightly stronger legs, a bit more efficient breathing, a better way of holding the head up or balancing a tail. Over time, these small differences accumulated, and from them emerged a group of animals that would come to shape the face of the land for tens of millions of years. To understand how dinosaurs rose to prominence, it helps to step back to a period when they were not yet the dominant presence. Early in the Mesozoic, the land was shared among a wide variety of reptiles and other vertebrates. Some were bulky and slow-moving, relying on heavy armour or sheer size for protection. Others were sleek and agile, built for speed and quick turns. Crocodile-like predators stalked river edges and floodplains. Large amphibians lingered in wetter regions, and early relatives of mammals scurried along the margins of this reptile-dominated world. The first dinosaurs appeared within this crowded landscape. They were not giants. Many were small, lightly built, and likely quick on their feet. What set them apart was not a single dramatic feature, but a combination of traits that worked well together. Their legs were positioned directly beneath their bodies rather than sprawling out to the sides. This posture allowed for more efficient movement, making walking and running less tiring over long distances. Their hips and tails formed a balanced structure that helped support this upright stance, giving them stability and control. Breathing also played a role. Dinosaurs are thought to have had a more advanced respiratory system than many of their contemporaries, with air sacs that allowed for a continuous flow of oxygen through the lungs. This system, similar in some ways to what birds use today, made it easier to sustain activity for longer periods. In a warm world where heat and exertion could quickly drain energy, this efficiency would have been a valuable advantage. These early dinosaurs lived in a world still shaped by the recovery from the great extinction that came before them. Many ecological roles were open or only loosely filled. There was room for experimentation, for new ways of feeding, moving, and surviving. As climates shifted and continents slowly pulled apart, environments changed, creating new challenges and new opportunities. Some dinosaurs adapted to eat plants, developing teeth suited for stripping leaves and grinding tough vegetation. Others specialized in hunting, with sharp teeth and claws designed for catching and holding prey. Over time, these different lifestyles led to a widening range of body shapes and sizes. Necks grew longer in some species, allowing them to reach higher into trees. Jaws became stronger in others, enabling them to tackle larger or more heavily built animals. Growth rates also mattered. Evidence from bone structure suggests that many dinosaurs grew relatively quickly, especially during their early years. This meant that they could reach a size where they were less vulnerable to predators in a shorter amount of time. Being able to move from a small, easily hunted juvenile to a more formidable adult more rapidly would have increased the chances of survival in a world where danger was always close by. As these animals spread across different regions, they encountered a variety of landscapes: forests, open plains, river valleys, and coastal areas all presented different conditions. Dinosaurs that thrived in one environment might struggle in another, leading to further diversification. Over many generations, populations became adapted to local conditions, resulting in a growing number of distinct species. Meanwhile, some of their competitors faced challenges of their own. Changes in climate and vegetation altered the availability of food and water. Shifting coastlines and the rise of new mountain ranges created barriers that limited movement and isolated populations. While many groups of reptiles and amphibians continued to survive and evolve, dinosaurs seemed particularly good at taking advantage of the changing world. The relationship between predators and herbivores also played a part in driving the rise of giants. As plant-eating dinosaurs grew larger, they gained protection simply through size. A massive body is harder to bring down, and even the most determined predator has to think carefully before attacking something that outweighs it by several tons. In response, some carnivorous dinosaurs also grew larger and more powerful, leading to an ongoing exchange where each side pushed the other toward new extremes. This process did not happen everywhere at once or in the same way. In some regions, medium-sized dinosaurs remained common for long stretches of time. In others, truly enormous forms appeared, with long necks, thick limbs, and bodies that could reach lengths of over 30 meters. These animals moved through the landscape like living hills, reshaping the environment simply by walking through it. Imagine one of these large plant-eaters making its way along a riverbank. Each step presses deep into the soft ground, leaving impressions that fill with water and mud. As it feeds, it strips leaves and branches from trees, opening up spaces in the canopy that allow sunlight to reach the forest floor. New plants take advantage of this light, changing the mix of vegetation in the area. Smaller animals move into the altered space, finding food and shelter among the new growth. In this way, the presence of a single large dinosaur can influence an entire community of living things. Predators too shape their surroundings. A large carnivorous dinosaur does not just hunt for food. Its movements and presence affect where other animals choose to graze, drink, and rest. Herbivores may avoid certain areas or gather in larger groups for safety. These patterns, repeated over time, can change the way plants grow and spread, creating landscapes that reflect the behaviour of the animals that live there. The rise of dinosaurs to dominance was also tied to the way they reproduced and cared for their young. Fossil evidence shows that many species laid eggs in nests, sometimes in large colonies. Some appear to have returned to the same nesting sites year after year. There are signs that at least certain dinosaurs provided care for their hatchlings, staying nearby and possibly bringing food. This level of parental investment can improve the survival rates of young animals, helping populations grow and maintain their presence in an area. Social behaviour may have played a role as well. Trackways preserved in stone suggest that some dinosaurs moved in groups. Travelling together can offer protection from predators and make it easier to find food. It can also help young animals learn important behaviours by following older, more experienced individuals. These social structures add another layer of complexity to how dinosaurs interacted with each other and their environment. As time went on, the world continued to change. The supercontinent of Pangaea broke apart further, creating new oceans and separating land masses. This geographic shift led to differences in climate and ecosystems across the planet. Dinosaurs on one continent began to follow evolutionary paths that differed from those on another. Some regions developed unique forms, adapted to local conditions in ways that were not seen elsewhere. In warmer, wetter areas, forests supported a rich diversity of plant life, which in turn allowed for large populations of herbivores. In drier regions, dinosaurs adapted to travel long distances in search of food and water. Some developed more efficient ways of conserving moisture, while others timed their movements to seasonal changes. The connection between dinosaurs and plants became even more significant, with the appearance of flowering plants later in the Mesozoic. These new plants offered different kinds of food, such as fruits and seeds, and grew in ways that changed the structure of the landscape. Herbivorous dinosaurs that could take advantage of these resources gained an edge, and their feeding habits influenced how these plants spread. The physical structure of dinosaurs themselves reflects this close relationship with their environment. Teeth vary widely between species, from flat, grinding surfaces suited for tough plant material to sharp, curved blades designed for slicing flesh. Limbs range from thick, pillar-like legs built to support enormous weight to slender, agile forms made for speed. Even the arrangement of bones within the body tells a story of adaptation to specific ways of living. It is tempting to think of size alone as the key to dinosaur success, but this would miss much of the picture. While many species did become very large, others remained relatively small and specialised. Some hunted in forests using cover to approach prey. Others lived along coastlines, feeding on fish and marine animals. Still others focused on specific types of plants, carving out narrow roles within their ecosystems. The world they lived in offered both stability and challenge. For long stretches of time, climates remained relatively warm and consistent, allowing ecosystems to develop and persist. At the same time, occasional disruptions, such as volcanic eruptions or changes in sea level, forced animals to adapt or move. Those that could respond flexibly to new conditions were more likely to survive and spread. One of the reasons dinosaurs became so widespread is that they were not limited to a single type of environment. They lived near the equator and closer to the poles. They occupied lowland floodplains and higher elevations. They thrived in forests, open areas and coastal regions. This broad range of habitats meant that as the planet changed, there were always places where dinosaurs could continue to do well. The passage of time during this era can be hard to grasp. Millions of years might pass between what we consider significant events. A species could appear, spread and disappear, leaving behind only a thin layer of fossils to mark its existence. Yet taken together, these countless individual stories form a long arc of rising influence. By the middle and later parts of the Mesozoic, dinosaurs had become the most prominent large animals on land. Their presence was felt across nearly every continent. They filled roles as top predators, dominant herbivores, and everything in between. Other groups of animals still existed, of course, but they often lived in the spaces left open by the sheer size and activity of these reptiles. The air above the land also began to change as some dinosaurs took to the sky. Early flying reptiles, known as pterosaurs, had already been gliding and soaring for some time, but later, birds evolved from small feathered dinosaurs. These new flyers added another dimension to the landscape, moving between trees, cliffs, and open spaces in ways that no land-bound animal could match. Feathers themselves are a reminder that the line between familiar categories is not always clear. What we think of as a bird today is, in many ways, a living dinosaur. The rise of giants on the ground was matched by the rise of lighter, more delicate forms in the air, showing how flexible this group of animals could be. At the same time, the oceans continued to host their own giants. Marine reptiles reached impressive sizes, and large fish and sharks patrolled the depths. The connection between land and sea remained strong, with nutrients flowing from rivers into coastal waters and marine animals sometimes venturing close to shore. All of these elements together create a picture of a world shaped by the presence of dinosaurs, but not defined by them alone. They were part of a larger system that included plants, insects, microorganisms, and the physical forces of the planet itself. Their rise was both a cause and a consequence of the changes happening around them. There is something quietly instructive about this story. The dominance of dinosaurs was not the result of a single moment of superiority, but of a long series of small, practical advantages that added up over time. Better movement, more efficient breathing, flexible diets, social behaviors that improved survival. These traits, tested again and again against the realities of a changing world, allowed dinosaurs to become what they did. As you imagine these animals moving through their landscapes, consider how much of their success was tied to the very ground beneath them and the air above them. Their bodies, their behaviours, and their lives were shaped by the same forces that shape all living things: the availability of food and water, the presence of danger, the pull of gravity, and the steady passage of time. The land they ruled was not static. Rivers shifted, forests grew and burned, seas advanced and retreated, continents drifted apart. Through all of this, dinosaurs adapted, diversified, and spread, leaving behind a record in stone that still speaks to us today. And as this long period of dominance unfolded, quieter stories continued alongside it. Small mammals refined their own survival strategies. Plants experimented with new ways of reproducing and spreading. Insects evolved in step with these changes, forming relationships that would later become central to the modern world. The rise of giants, then, is not just a tale of big animals becoming bigger. It is a story about how life responds to opportunity, how systems grow and change together, and how the shape of the world can be influenced by the creatures that move across it every day. Above the steady rhythm of footsteps and the rustle of leaves on the forest floor, another story was quietly unfolding, one that did not stay bound to soil, stone, or water. Movement began to stretch upward, into the space between branches and clouds, into currents of air that had always been there but had not yet been fully explored by living things. Life, which had already learned how to swim and walk and crawl, started to experiment with something more uncertain, the possibility of leaving the ground behind, even if only for a moment at first. Long before true birds filled the sky with familiar silhouettes, the world was already populated by creatures that blurred the line between reptile and something new. Scales still covered much of their bodies, tough and protective, built for life in a world of heat, rough terrain, and physical struggle. Yet among these hard surfaces appeared softer structures, thin filaments and branching shapes that we now recognize as early feathers. At first, these were not tools for flight. They likely served practical purposes, helping to regulate body temperature, display colors or patterns for communication, or protect the skin. The appearance of feathers marked a subtle but important shift. Feathers are complex structures, far more intricate than scales. Their development suggests a growing emphasis on fine control over the body's interaction with the environment. They trap air close to the skin, helping to retain warmth. They can be arranged to shed water or channel it away. They can be coloured or patterned in ways that catch the eye of potential mates or warn rivals to keep their distance. Small feathered dinosaurs moved through forests and open spaces, their bodies lighter and more agile than many of their larger relatives. Some ran along the ground, using speed and quick turns to catch insects or small prey. Others climbed trees, gripping bark with curved claws and moving through branches with careful, deliberate steps. In these elevated spaces, away from the heavy footfalls of large animals, a new kind of freedom began to take shape. Gliding likely came before true flight. A creature perched on a branch might leap toward another, spreading feathered arms or skin membranes to slow its descent. Even a short glide could make the difference between a safe landing and a dangerous fall. Over many generations, natural selection would favour individuals that could control these movements more effectively. Longer feathers, broader surfaces, and stronger chest muscles all contributed to greater stability in the air. At the same time, another group of animals was already making use of the sky in a different way. Pterosaurs, flying reptiles unrelated to dinosaurs, had developed large, wing-like membranes supported by elongated fingers. These wings allowed them to soar over coastlines and inland waters, scanning for fish or other prey. Some pterosaurs were small, with wingspans no wider than a modern bird's, while others grew to enormous sizes, with wings that stretched wider than a small airplane. The presence of these flyers changed the dynamics of the landscape. From the air, a predator could spot movements that were hidden from view on the ground. Schools of fish near the surface, herds of plant-eaters moving along a river, or the glint of water in a dry region could all become visible from above. This new perspective added pressure on animals below to develop better camouflage, more careful behaviour, and in some cases their own ways of reaching the air. Within the feathered dinosaurs, certain lineages began to show features that would later become hallmarks of birds. Their bones grew lighter, with hollow spaces that reduced weight without sacrificing strength. Their arms became longer relative to their bodies, and the arrangement of feathers along these limbs grew more organised, forming surfaces that could push against the air. The tail, once a long, muscular counterbalance, began to shorten in some forms, replaced by a fan of feathers that could be spread or folded. This change helped improve control during gliding or short bursts of flapping. Over time, these adaptations built on each other, creating animals that were no longer simply leaping and falling, but actively moving through the air in controlled ways. Imagine standing in a clearing at the edge of a forest during this period. The ground is alive with movement. Insects crawl and buzz among fallen leaves. Small reptiles dart between shadows. Somewhere nearby, a larger animal passes, its steps felt more than heard. Then, above you, something stirs. A feathered creature moves along a branch, pauses, and then launches itself outward. Its wings spread, catching the air, and it glides across the open space to another tree. The movement is not as smooth or sustained as that of a modern bird, but it is enough to change how this animal experiences its world. This ability to move between ground and sky opened up new sources of food and new places to live. Flying or gliding animals could reach insects in the air, fruits or seeds high in trees, and nesting sites on cliffs or tall branches that were inaccessible to ground-based predators. These advantages created strong incentives for further refinement of flight-related traits. The development of early birds did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern of experimentation within the dinosaur group. Feathers appeared in many species that never took to the air. Some of these animals remained firmly ground-bound, using their feather coverings for insulation or display rather than flight. Others developed long, decorative feathers on tails or limbs, possibly to attract mates or signal status within a group. This variety shows that feathers themselves were not invented for flying. They were a flexible tool that evolution repurposed in different ways. Flight was one of those uses, but not the only one, and not necessarily the first. While feathered dinosaurs were exploring these new possibilities, the world below continued to shape their lives. Forests provided cover and perches. Open areas offered space for takeoff and landing. Rivers and wetlands attracted insects and small animals, creating feeding grounds for creatures that could approach from above. The climate of the Mesozoic, generally warmer and more even than today's, also played a role. Without large ice caps at the poles for much of this era, temperature differences between regions were less extreme. This allowed flying animals to range more widely, moving across different parts of the planet without encountering the same sharp barriers of cold that exist today. In the coastal regions, pterosaurs became common sights. Some species skimmed low over the water, dipping their jaws into the sea to catch fish. Others soared higher, riding rising columns of warm air known as thermals. These air currents, created when the sun heats the land, allowed large pterosaurs to stay aloft with minimal effort, gliding for long distances without flapping. The presence of such large flying animals is a reminder that the air itself was a different place during the Mesozoic. Higher levels of oxygen in some periods may have made it easier for large-bodied creatures to sustain flight. Warm temperatures and widespread open spaces created conditions that supported a wide range of aerial lifestyles. On land, interactions between ground-based and air-based animals added complexity to the ecosystem. A predator approaching from above could force prey to change behaviour, seeking cover under dense vegetation, or staying closer to trees and cliffs. At the same time, flying animals had to watch for dangers below, including larger dinosaurs that might attack if given the chance. Nesting behaviour also became an important part of life between ground and sky. Early birds and feathered dinosaurs likely built nests in trees, on cliffs, or in sheltered spots on the ground. Eggs needed protection from both weather and predators, and the choice of nesting site could make a significant difference in survival rates. Fossil evidence suggests that some of these animals brooded their eggs, sitting on them to keep them warm, much like modern birds. This behaviour represents a shift toward more active parental care, a trend that may have helped young animals survive in a world filled with threats. The physical structure of early wings reveals the balance these creatures had to strike. Wings needed to be strong enough to support the body's weight, yet light enough to allow lift. Muscles had to be powerful, but not so heavy that they made flight impossible. Bones had to resist stress without becoming brittle. Each of these requirements influenced the others, creating a system where small changes could have wide-ranging effects. The result of this balancing act was not a single path to flight, but several. Some animals specialized in gliding, using gravity and height to move from place to place. Others developed flapping flight, generating their own lift and thrust. Still others may have used a combination of both, running along the ground or leaping from elevated spots to gain speed before spreading their wings. These different strategies reflect the variety of environments available. In dense forests, short, controlled flights between trees might be more useful than long-distance soaring. Along coastlines and open plains, the ability to travel farther and stay aloft longer could offer greater benefits. As these aerial lifestyles took hold, they began to influence the broader ecosystem. Flying animals became important seed dispersers, carrying plant material from one place to another in their digestive systems or on their feathers. This helped plants spread into new areas, shaping the distribution of vegetation across the landscape. Insects, too, responded to the presence of predators in the air. Some developed better camouflage. Others changed their activity patterns, becoming more active at times of day when flying hunters were less common. This ongoing exchange drove further evolution on both sides. The line between reptile and bird grew increasingly blurred. Feathers, once rare, became more widespread. Skeletons shifted toward lighter, more flexible forms. Behaviour changed, with greater emphasis on vocal communication, social interaction, and complex mating displays. At the same time, the older scaled forms did not disappear. Large, scaly dinosaurs continued to dominate the ground, and reptiles of many kinds thrived in both land and water. The world was not being replaced, but expanded, adding new layers of life rather than discarding the old ones. The sky itself became a shared space. Pterosaurs and early birds likely competed for some of the same resources, especially in coastal and wetland areas. Differences in size, flight style, and feeding habits would have allowed them to occupy slightly different niches, reducing direct competition. Over millions of years, these interactions shaped the development of modern bird lineages. By the later parts of the Mesozoic, animals that we would clearly recognize as birds had appeared, with beaks, strong wings, and the ability to fly long distances. They sang, nested, and migrated in ways that begin to resemble the patterns we see today. This transition did not happen overnight. It was the result of countless small changes, each one building on the last. A slightly longer feather here, a lighter bone there, a new behaviour that improved survival just enough to be passed on. The story of life between ground and sky is, in many ways, a story about exploring new dimensions. By moving upward, animals gained access to resources and perspectives that were unavailable to those bound to the surface. This expansion did not make the ground less important, but it added a new layer of connection between different parts of the world. From above, a flying animal could see the shape of a river's bend, the outline of a forest, the glimmer of a distant lake. This broader view may have influenced movement patterns, helping animals find food or suitable nesting sites more efficiently. On the ground, the presence of life in the air added another element to daily routines. Animals learned to look up as well as around. The sky was no longer just a backdrop, but an active part of the environment, filled with movement and possibility. The materials that made flight possible, feathers, hollow bones, strong muscles, also found uses beyond the air. Feathers insulated bodies against cool nights. They displayed signals to others. They may have helped regulate temperature during periods of intense activity. Even after the end of the Mesozoic, when many of the largest dinosaurs disappeared, these feathered lineages continued. Birds carried forward this legacy, becoming one of the most widespread and diverse groups of animals on the planet. Every sparrow, eagle, and seabird today is a living reminder of this ancient exploration of the space between ground and sky. Yet during the time we are considering, this future was not yet written. The air was still a relatively new frontier, and the forms that moved through it were varied and experimental. Some would lead to lasting success, others would fade away, leaving only impressions in stone to hint at their existence. The landscapes below continued to change, shaped by the same forces of water, wind, and shifting continents that had always been at work. Forests grew and receded, coastlines moved, rivers changed course. Through all of this, the animals that bridged earth and air adapted, finding ways to fit into a world that never stood still. It becomes clear that the story of the Mesozoic is not only about size or dominance, it is also about expansion, about life testing the boundaries of where it can go and how it can live. Beneath the calm skin of the sea, where sunlight thins into pale ribbons, and the world above becomes a wavering mirror, another version of the Mesozoic unfolded in quiet, steady motion. This underwater realm did not announce itself with towering silhouettes or the heavy footfalls that marked life on land. Instead, It revealed its presence through currents, shifting light, and the constant gentle movement of water that carried life from one place to another without pause or ceremony. The ocean during this era covered most of the planet, far more than it does today. Vast stretches of open water connected distant coastlines, and warm, shallow seas flooded across low-lying continental areas, creating broad shelves where sunlight could reach the bottom. These sunlit regions became centres of activity, filled with drifting organisms, growing reefs, and a layered community of animals that depended on one another in ways both simple and complex. At the foundation of this marine world were tiny forms of life, almost invisible to the naked eye. Microscopic plankton floated near the surface, carried by currents and guided by light. Some of these organisms use sunlight to make their own food, releasing oxygen into the water as a byproduct. Others fed on their neighbours, forming the first links in a chain that stretched upward to the largest creatures in the sea. The presence of this plankton shaped everything else. Where it was abundant, life flourished. Fish gathered to feed, and larger animals followed them. In areas where currents brought nutrients up from deeper water, the surface became especially rich, creating hotspots of activity that could be seen even from a distance as darker, more vibrant patches on the water's surface. Moving closer to shore, the seafloor rose into reefs and rocky outcrops built by countless small animals over long spans of time. These structures provided shelter and feeding grounds for a wide variety of species. Shellfish anchored themselves to hard surfaces. Crustaceans crept through narrow spaces. Small fish darted in and out of crevices, always alert to sudden movement. The reefs themselves were living constructions. Layer by layer, generation after generation, tiny reef-building organisms added their skeletons to the growing mass. Over thousands of years, these efforts created complex underwater landscapes that changed the flow of water and influenced where sediment settled. The shape of the reef affected what could live there, and what lived there in turn shaped the reef. Beyond these shallower regions, the water deepened and the light faded. Colours softened and then disappeared entirely, leaving a world defined more by motion and pressure than by sight. In these dimmer spaces, life took on different forms. Some animals developed large eyes to gather as much light as possible. Others relied more heavily on senses like smell or the detection of vibrations in the water. Among the most striking inhabitants of these waters were the marine reptiles, creatures that traced their ancestry back to land but had returned to the sea in search of opportunity. Their bodies reflected this dual heritage. They breathed air and often had lungs similar to those of their land-dwelling relatives, yet their shapes were adapted for swimming. Long, powerful tails provided propulsion, while limbs transformed into flippers or paddle-like structures that helped steer and stabilize. Ichthyosaurs, for example, had bodies that closely resembled modern dolphins. Their streamlined forms reduced resistance as they moved through the water, allowing them to chase fast-moving prey. Their jaws were lined with sharp teeth suited for catching fish and squid-like animals, and their large eyes suggest they may have hunted in low-light conditions, perhaps diving into deeper waters where fewer competitors followed. Plesiosaurs took a different approach. Some had long necks and relatively small heads, giving them a distinctive, almost serpentine appearance. Their 4 strong flippers worked together to move them through the water in a kind of underwater flight, similar to how sea turtles swim today. These animals may have used their long necks to reach into schools of fish, or to probe into reefs and rocky areas where prey could hide. Mosasaurus and its relatives, which appeared later in the Mesozoic, were among the largest marine predators of the time. Their powerful jaws and strong muscular bodies made them formidable hunters. They likely fed on a wide range of animals, including fish, smaller marine reptiles, and even seabirds that ventured too close to the water's surface. The presence of these large predators influenced the behaviour of many other creatures. Fish formed tighter schools, smaller reptiles stayed closer to cover. Even the distribution of plankton could be affected, as changes in the movements of fish and other animals altered how nutrients were mixed in the water. Not all of the ocean's residents were large or fast. The seafloor was home to a wide range of slow-moving and stationary animals. Ammonites, relatives of modern squids and octopuses, drifted or swam through the water, their coiled shells providing protection and buoyancy. Some species had smooth shells, while others were decorated with ridges and spines that may have helped deter predators or stabilize them in the water. On the bottom, starfish-like animals, sea urchins, and various kinds of worms worked their way through the sediment, feeding on organic material that settled from above. This constant process of breaking down and recycling matter helped maintain the balance of nutrients in the ecosystem, supporting the growth of new plankton and continuing the cycle. The movement of water itself was a powerful force in shaping life in these seas. Currents carried larvae and spores across great distances, connecting populations that might otherwise be isolated. Tides rose and fell, exposing shallow areas to the air and then covering them again, creating challenging conditions for animals that lived in these border zones. Storms added another layer of change. Strong winds could churn up the surface, mixing deeper, cooler water with warmer layers above. This mixing brought nutrients upward, often triggering bursts of plankton growth that rippled through the food web. At the same time, storms could damage reefs, shift sand and sediment and reshape coastlines, forcing animals to adapt to altered landscapes. Temperature differences between regions also influenced where certain species could live. Warmer waters near the equator supported high levels of diversity, while cooler areas closer to the poles hosted fewer, more specialized forms. Over time, as climates shifted and continents moved, these boundaries changed, allowing some species to expand their ranges while others retreated or disappeared. The relationship between land and sea was especially important in the Mesozoic. Rivers carried nutrients from the continents into the oceans, feeding coastal ecosystems. Fallen leaves, branches, and even the bodies of land animals occasionally made their way into the water, becoming part of the marine food web. In return, the sea influenced the land through storms, tides, and the slow rise and fall of sea levels. In shallow coastal waters, these connections were particularly strong. Mangrove-like plants and other vegetation grew along the edges, stabilizing sediment and providing shelter for young fish and invertebrates. These areas served as nurseries, places where many species spent their early lives before moving out into deeper or more open waters. The boundary zone also attracted flying animals. Pterosaurs and early birds often hunted along coastlines, diving for fish or scavenging along the shore. Their presence linked the marine and terrestrial worlds in visible, dynamic ways, as shadows passed over the water and wings brushed against the surface. The deeper parts of the ocean remained more mysterious, both to the animals that lived near the surface and to modern scientists. Fossils from these regions are rarer, because conditions there are less likely to preserve remains. Still, evidence suggests that life extended far below the sunlit zone, adapting to low light, high pressure, and colder temperatures. Some animals developed bioluminescence, producing their own light to attract prey, find mates, or confuse predators. This soft living glow added a different kind of presence to the darkness, creating brief points of brightness in an otherwise shadowed world. The idea of shadows in these oceans is not just about darkness, but about the way large shapes moved through the water, casting shifting outlines against lighter backgrounds. A massive predator passing overhead would create a sudden change in light that smaller animals could detect and respond to. This sensitivity to contrast and motion became an important part of survival, guiding when to hide and when to move. Life cycles in the sea often followed patterns tied to the moon and the seasons. Many animals timed their reproduction to specific phases of the lunar cycle, releasing eggs and sperm into the water when tides and currents would carry them to favourable places. These synchronized events could fill the water with clouds of life, turning entire regions into nurseries for the next generation. Over long periods, these rhythms contributed to the stability of marine ecosystems. Even as individual species came and went, the overall structure of the system remained, supported by the constant flow of energy from sunlight to plankton, to larger animals and back again through decomposition. The presence of reefs, shelves, and deep basins created a layered ocean, with different communities stacked on top of each other. Near the surface, fast-moving fish and reptiles chase prey in well-lit waters. Below, slower, more specialised animals occupied dimmer zones. At the bottom, creatures adapted to cold, dark conditions worked quietly through the sediment. Each layer influenced the others. A change in plankton levels at the surface could affect the entire system, reducing food for fish, which in turn impacted predators. A shift in ocean temperature could alter current patterns, redistributing nutrients and changing which regions were most productive. The scale of these processes is difficult to fully appreciate. The Mesozoic oceans existed for tens of millions of years, long enough for entire lineages of animals to rise, spread across the globe, and disappear again. The rocks that now form cliffs and hills in many parts of the world were once layers of mud and sand laid down in these ancient seas, slowly accumulating grain by grain. Fossils found in these rocks provide glimpses into moments from this long history. A shell preserved in stone, a tooth embedded in sediment, or a skeleton flattened by pressure tells a story of a single life in a vast, ongoing system. When scientists piece these fragments together, they begin to see patterns of migration, adaptation, and change that stretch across continents and eras. The idea of strange creatures beneath the waves is not just about unusual shapes or impressive sizes. It is also about the unfamiliar ways of living that developed in this environment. Animals that never touched land, that spent their entire lives suspended in water, that relied on currents and tides as much as on muscles and bones, represent a different approach to existence. Some of these creatures, like the ancestors of modern fish and cephalopods, would continue into the present, adapting and evolving as the world changed. Others, like many of the large marine reptiles, would vanish, leaving behind only traces in stone and in the genetic echoes of their distant relatives. As the Mesozoic progressed, the oceans themselves changed. Sea levels rose and fell. New seaways opened between continents. Climate shifts altered water temperatures and circulation patterns. These changes created new habitats and removed others, reshaping the distribution of life across the globe. At times, shallow seas covered large portions of the continents, turning inland regions into marine environments. At other times, the water retreated, exposing new land and creating isolated basins. Each of these phases offered different opportunities and challenges for marine and coastal species. The close connection between land and sea meant that events in one often had consequences in the other. Large volcanic eruptions on land could release gases that affected ocean chemistry. Changes in vegetation on continents could alter the amount of nutrients flowing into the water. Even the movement of animals between these realms contributed to the exchange of energy and matter. Holding this picture of the Mesozoic Ocean in mind, a world of layered light and shadow, of drifting plankton and powerful predators, it becomes clear that the story of this era is not confined to what happened on land. The seas were just as active, just as full of experimentation and change. Every wave that rolled against an ancient shore carried with it the influence of distant places and deep waters. Every current linked one region to another, moving life, heat, and nutrients across the planet. The ocean was not a backdrop, but a central player in the unfolding of life's history. Somewhere along the long, steady timeline of the Mesozoic, the green world began to change in a way that did not announce itself with thunder or fire, but with something far quieter and far more far-reaching. The transformation did not come in the form of towering trees or sweeping forests at first. It arrived in small, subtle structures that many of the large animals around them likely ignored. Tiny buds formed, new kinds of leaves unfurled, and for the first time in Earth's history, plants began to grow parts whose main purpose was not simply to survive, but to communicate. Before this shift, most of the land was ruled by plants that relied on wind and water to carry their reproductive material. Ferns released spores into the air, hoping that a few would land in the right place to grow. Conifers and cycads produced seeds and pollen that drifted on breezes, a strategy that worked well across wide open landscapes. These methods did not require partnerships. They depended on chance, volume, and time. The first flowering plants, known today as angiosperms, introduced a different approach. Instead of sending their pollen out blindly into the world, they began to invite specific helpers. They grew colourful structures, produced scents, and offered small rewards like nectar. These features were not just decorative, they were signals, designed to attract insects and other animals that would move pollen from one plant to another more efficiently than the wind ever could. In the early stages of this change, these plants were not dominant. They appeared as small, scattered forms along riverbanks, in disturbed soil, and in open spaces where sunlight reached the ground. Their leaves were often broad and soft, unlike the tough, needle-like or leathery leaves of many older plant groups. Their stems grew quickly, allowing them to take advantage of temporary opportunities created by floods, landslides, or the movement of large animals. These early flowering plants lived in a world that was still largely shaped by ferns, conifers, and cycads. The forests were tall and structured, with high canopies and shaded floors. Sunlight did not always reach the ground in strong direct beams. In these conditions, small, fast-growing plants had an advantage. They could sprout, grow, flower, and produce seeds within a relatively short time, completing their life cycles before being overshadowed by larger, slower-growing trees. The appearance of flowers began to change the behaviour of animals in subtle ways. Insects, which had already been present for hundreds of millions of years, found new sources of food. Nectar provided a concentrated form of energy, and pollen offered protein. As insects visited these plants, they carried pollen on their bodies, moving it from one flower to another. This relationship was not one-sided. Plants that were better at attracting insects reproduced more successfully. Insects that were better at finding and using these plants had more energy and better chances of survival. Over time, this mutual influence led to a kind of quiet partnership, with plants and pollinators shaping each other's evolution. Different insects began to specialize. Some became better at crawling into narrow flower shapes. Others developed longer mouth parts to reach deep nectar stores. Their senses became more tuned to specific colours and scents. In response, plants developed flowers that matched these preferences, creating a growing diversity of forms and patterns across the landscape. The spread of flowering plants did not happen all at once or everywhere at the same time. It was a gradual process that unfolded over millions of years. In some regions, they remained rare for long stretches, while in others they began to spread more quickly, especially in environments where disturbance created open ground. Rivers played an important role in this expansion. Floods regularly reshaped riverbanks, washing away existing vegetation and leaving behind bare soil. These open spaces were ideal for fast-growing plants that could quickly establish themselves and complete their life cycles. Seeds carried by water or animals found places to settle and grow, extending the range of these new plant types. As flowering plants became more common, they started to change the structure of the land itself. Their roots often grew in dense networks, holding soil together and reducing erosion. This stability affected how water moved across the surface, slowing runoff and allowing more moisture to soak into the ground. Over time, this created conditions that favoured even more plant growth, reinforcing the presence of these newcomers. The variety of leaves and growth forms also influenced the way sunlight was captured and used. Broad leaves could gather light efficiently even in shaded conditions. Low-growing plants filled in spaces between larger trees, creating more continuous layers of vegetation. This increased the overall productivity of many ecosystems, meaning more energy was available to support animals at all levels of the food chain. Herbivorous dinosaurs and other plant-eating animals encountered new kinds of food as these plants spread. Some species may have avoided the softer, unfamiliar leaves at first, sticking to the tougher, fibrous plants they had evolved to eat. Others likely experimented, discovering that these new plants could be easier to chew and digest. Over time, this shift in available food influenced the evolution of plant eaters. Teeth and jaws adapted to handle a wider range of plant material. Feeding behaviours changed, with animals spending more time browsing closer to the ground, or along the edges of forests where flowering plants were most common. The changes did not stop there. Predators were affected as well. When herbivores altered their movement patterns to follow new plant growth, the animals that hunted them had to adjust. This ripple effect moved through the entire ecosystem, linking the spread of small flowers to the behaviour of some of the largest creatures on land. The influence of flowering plants reached into the soil as well. Their roots interacted with fungi and microorganisms, forming networks that helped move nutrients between plants. These underground partnerships improved the efficiency of nutrient uptake, allowing plants to grow in soils that might otherwise be too poor to support them. This further expanded the range of environments where flowering plants could thrive. Seeds, another key feature of these plants, added a new dimension to how vegetation spread. Many flowering plants produce seeds enclosed in fruits. These fruits attracted animals, which ate them and carried the seeds to new locations in their digestive systems or on their bodies. When the seeds were deposited, often along with a small package of natural fertilizer, they had a good chance of growing in a new place. This method of dispersal created strong connections between plants and animals. The movement of herds and flocks became a way for plant species to travel across the landscape. Rivers and coastlines, which animals often followed, turned into pathways for the spread of new vegetation. As flowering plants became more established, they began to form the basis for new kinds of ecosystems. Shrublands and early forms of what would later become grasslands started to appear in some regions. These open areas supported different communities of animals than dense forest did, favouring species that could move quickly across open ground or that relied on sight rather than cover. Even though true grasses would not become widespread until later, the presence of low-growing flowering plants began to change how the ground layer of many landscapes looked and functioned. The world became more textured, with a greater variety of plant heights, shapes, and densities. The appearance of flowers also changed the sensory experience of the land. Scents carried on the air, subtle at first, then more noticeable as the number and variety of flowering plants increased. Colours, which had previously been limited mostly to shades of green and brown, began to include hints of yellow, white, and other tones. These visual and chemical signals added a new layer of information to the environment, one that insects and other animals learned to read. Climate played a role in how quickly these changes spread. In warmer, wetter regions, flowering plants often found it easier to establish themselves. In drier or cooler areas, their expansion could be slower, limited by the availability of water or suitable growing seasons. As the continents continued to move and climates shifted, the balance between different plant groups changed from place to place. Some older plant lineages declined in areas where flowering plants became dominant. Conifers and cycads remained important, especially in certain climates and regions, but the overall mix of vegetation began to tilt. This did not happen because flowering plants were inherently better, but because their strategies worked well in the changing conditions of the late Mesozoic. The pace of this transformation was slow enough that it would not have been obvious to any individual animal living through it. A single dinosaur might see a slightly different mix of plants in its lifetime, but the larger shift would only become clear across many generations. Fossil layers stacked one on top of another now reveal this gradual replacement and expansion. The story of how plants changed the face of the Earth is also a story about time and patience. Seeds buried in the ground might wait months or years before sprouting. Trees took decades or longer to reach full size. Entire forests could take centuries to recover after a disturbance. These long cycles created a background rhythm that shaped the lives of animals and the flow of ecosystems. The impact of flowering plants extended beyond land. When leaves and organic material washed into rivers and oceans, they influenced aquatic ecosystems as well. Increased plant growth on land could lead to more nutrients entering the water, supporting plankton and, in turn, marine life. This connection linked the spread of flowers to changes in the seas. Even the atmosphere felt the effects. As plant communities changed, so did the balance of gases exchanged between the land and the air. Photosynthesis drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and released oxygen, influencing climate and the conditions under which animals lived. The relationship between plants and fire also shifted. Different kinds of vegetation burn in different ways. As flowering plants became more common, the patterns of natural fires changed in some regions. Fires in turn created open spaces where fast-growing plants could thrive, reinforcing their spread. This cycle added another layer of interaction between the living and non-living parts of the environment. Insects, birds, and small mammals found new roles in this evolving world. Pollination and seed dispersal created opportunities for specialization. Animals that were good at these tasks gained reliable food sources. Plants that were good at attracting these animals spread more widely. Over time, this led to increasingly complex networks of dependence and cooperation. The quiet influence of flowers stands in contrast to the more dramatic changes often associated with the Mesozoic, such as the rise and fall of large dinosaurs or the movement of continents. Yet this botanical shift may have had an equally profound effect on the future of life on Earth. By reshaping landscapes, altering food webs, and changing how organisms interacted, flowering plants laid the groundwork for many of the ecosystems we recognize today. It is worth pausing on how understated this transformation would have seemed at the time. No sudden boundary in the rock record marks the first appearance of a flower. There is no single moment that can be pointed to as the beginning of this new world. Instead, there are scattered fossils, pollen grains, and leaf impressions that gradually become more common as layers build up over millions of years. From these small pieces, a picture emerges of a planet slowly dressing itself in new forms of green, experimenting with new ways of growing, reproducing, and connecting with the animals around it. The forests and plains did not vanish, but they gained new textures and patterns, new rhythms and relationships. As flowering plants continued to spread, they influenced where animals lived, how they moved, and what they ate. These changes fed back into the evolution of animals, including the feathered creatures that took to the air and the mammals that still lived mostly in the shadows. The world became more interconnected, with more pathways for energy and matter to flow between different parts of the system. Looking at this long process from a distance, it becomes clear that the face of the Earth is not shaped only by dramatic events or dominant creatures. It is also shaped by small, persistent changes that build on one another over vast stretches of time. A new kind of leaf, a new way to attract an insect, a new method of spreading a seed. Each of these adds a thread to the larger tapestry of life. As this green transformation continued, it set the stage for further shifts in the balance of ecosystems. The spread of new plants created opportunities for animals that could take advantage of them, and pressures for those that could not. These dynamics would play out across the remaining span of the Mesozoic and beyond, influencing which lineages thrived and which faded away. Tucked away beneath roots, fallen branches, and the shadowed edges of rocks, another story of the Mesozoic unfolded almost entirely out of sight. While towering bodies moved across plains and long necks rose above forest canopies, much of the planet's quieter life stayed close to the ground, in narrow spaces where light filtered in softly and danger could be sensed before it was seen. Here, in these overlooked corners of the world, early mammals lived their small, careful lives, shaping a future that no one at the time could have predicted. These animals did not arrive as dominant forces. They did not command landscapes or leave deep impressions in the mud with every step. Instead, they slipped through the spaces that larger creatures left behind. Their bodies were compact, their movements quick, and their habits often secretive. Many were no bigger than modern mice, shrews, or squirrels. This size, which might seem like a disadvantage in a world filled with giants, turned out to be one of their greatest strengths. Being small meant needing less food and water to survive. It meant being able to hide in places that larger animals could not reach. It meant being able to move through dense undergrowth, narrow burrows, and tangled roots without drawing attention. These traits allowed early mammals to persist, even when the land was dominated by much larger and more powerful creatures. The physical features of these animals set them apart from most of the reptiles around them. Fur covered their bodies, providing insulation against cool nights and changing temperatures. This layer of hair, combined with warm-blooded metabolism, allowed them to stay active when the air cooled and many reptiles became sluggish. As the sun set and the landscape shifted into shadow, mammals often found their moment. Nighttime in the Mesozoic carried a different atmosphere than day. Without artificial light, darkness was complete. The world narrowed to what could be heard, smelled, or felt. Early mammals were well suited to this environment. Their senses were tuned for low-light conditions. Whiskers helped them feel their way through tight spaces. Sensitive noses picked up faint traces of food or danger. Keen hearing allowed them to detect the movements of insects or the distant steps of a predator. These abilities supported a lifestyle that relied on caution and flexibility. Many early mammals were omnivorous, eating a mix of insects, seeds, fruits, and small animals. This varied diet made them less dependent on any single food source, an advantage in a world where conditions could change with the seasons or the movement of larger animals. Some species specialized in certain types of food. Insect eaters developed sharp, pointed teeth for catching and crushing hard shells. Others had flatter teeth suited for grinding plant material. This diversity of feeding strategies helped mammals spread into different ecological roles, even while staying largely out of the spotlight. Burrowing became an important behavior for many of these animals. Tunnels provided protection from predators and from the extremes of weather. Underground, temperatures remained more stable, offering shelter from heat during the day and cold at night. Burrows also served as safe places to raise young, away from the constant risks of the open surface. The construction of these tunnels influenced the landscape in small but meaningful ways. By moving soil and creating underground spaces, mammals helped aerate the ground, allowing water and air to penetrate more easily. This, in turn, benefited plants and microorganisms, contributing to the health of the soil. Even at this early stage, mammals were quietly shaping their environment. Reproduction and care of the young were central parts of their lives. Unlike most reptiles, mammals gave birth to live young, or, in the case of some early forms, laid eggs, but still provided extended care afterward. Mothers nursed their offspring with milk, a nutrient-rich food that allowed young animals to grow quickly and develop strong immune systems. This level of parental investment increased the chances that offspring would survive to adulthood. While it meant producing fewer young at a time compared to animals that laid large numbers of eggs, it also meant that each individual had a better chance of making it through the vulnerable early stages of life. Social behavior varied among species. Some early mammals likely lived alone, meeting only to mate. Others may have formed small family groups or colonies, sharing burrows and cooperating in raising young. These social structures could provide additional protection and improve access to resources. Communication among these animals was subtle. Soft vocalizations, body language, and scent marking all played roles in signaling territory, readiness to mate, or the presence of danger. The use of scent was particularly important, as smells could linger in an area long after the animal had moved on, providing information to others without the need for direct contact. The development of more complex brains also set mammals on a distinct path. Their nervous systems allowed for flexible behaviour, learning, and memory. This meant they could adapt their actions based on experience, remembering where food was found or which areas were especially dangerous. This capacity for learning supported exploration. Small mammals could investigate new environments, test different food sources, and adjust their routines in response to changing conditions. Over time, this flexibility would become one of the defining features of the group. The presence of flowering plants, which were becoming more common during this part of the Mesozoic, opened up new opportunities. Fruits and seeds provided concentrated sources of energy. Mammals that fed on these foods could help spread the plants by carrying seeds to new locations. This created another layer of connection between these small animals and the broader ecosystem. Trees and shrubs offered additional habitat. Some mammals became skilled climbers, moving through branches to reach food or escape predators. Their grasping hands and feet, along with flexible joints, allowed them to navigate complex three-dimensional spaces. In the canopy, these animals encountered insects, fruits, and nesting sites that were less accessible to ground-dwelling predators. This vertical movement added another dimension to their lives, linking the forest floor to the spaces above. Water sources also played an important role. Streams and ponds attracted insects and supported plant growth, creating rich feeding grounds. Mammals visited these areas carefully, often under cover of darkness, aware that predators also watched these same places. The threat from larger animals was constant. Dinosaurs, both carnivorous and herbivorous, shaped the behaviour of mammals even when they were not directly interacting. The movement of a herd could flatten vegetation, changing the cover available. A predator passing through could leave behind a trail of scent or disturbed ground that signalled danger. To survive in this environment, mammals developed a sense of timing. They learned when it was safest to move, when to rest, and when to forage. This rhythm was closely tied to the cycle of day and night, as well as to seasonal changes in food availability. The climate of the Mesozoic, generally warm and stable in many regions, provided a relatively predictable backdrop. However, variations in rainfall and temperature still created challenges. During dry periods, water and food became harder to find. During wetter times, flooding could destroy burrows and force animals to relocate. These challenges encouraged mobility. Some species likely travelled short distances in search of better conditions, while others adapted to make the most of what was available in a smaller area. This balance between movement and staying put influenced how populations spread and how genetic diversity developed over time. Fossil evidence of early mammals is often limited, partly because their small bones are less likely to be preserved. Still, the remains that have been found reveal a surprising variety of forms. There were long-bodied, weasel-like animals, tree climbers with strong limbs and claws, and burrowers with compact, sturdy frames. Each of these body shapes reflects a particular way of living, a set of choices about where to find food, how to avoid danger, and how to move through the world. Taken together, they show that mammals were not just one simple group waiting in the wings, but a collection of diverse active participants in the Mesozoic ecosystem. The relationship between mammals and insects is especially worth noting. Insects were abundant and varied, providing a reliable food source. Mammals that fed on them helped keep their populations in check, while insects, in turn, influenced where mammals could find food. This interaction extended to the spread of plants. Insects pollinated flowers, mammals ate fruits and dispersed seeds. Plants provided shelter and resources for both. This network of relationships created a web of connections that tied even the smallest animals to the largest patterns of change in the landscape. The quiet nature of mammal life during this time does not mean it was simple or uneventful. On the scale of an individual animal, every day involved decisions that could mean the difference between survival and death. Where to forage, when to move, how to respond to a sound in the darkness. These choices, repeated over generations, shape the evolution of the group. There is something steady and almost comforting about imagining these small creatures going about their routines beneath the larger drama of the era. While massive bodies moved across the land and large predators hunted in the open, mammals focused on the immediate, the nearby, and the familiar. Their world was measured in short distances and small spaces, in burrows and branches rather than in plains and horizons. This focus on the close and the detailed may have helped prepare mammals for what would come later. When the conditions of the planet changed dramatically, those that could adapt quickly, explore new niches, and take advantage of new opportunities would be in a strong position to thrive. The groundwork for this future was being laid quietly during the Mesozoic. Brain development, social behaviour, varied diets, and flexible movement all contributed to a toolkit that would become increasingly valuable in a changing world. As the era progressed, mammals continued to diversify, even if they remained largely out of sight. New forms appeared, experimenting with different body plans and lifestyles. Some grew slightly larger, others became more specialised. The group as a whole expanded its presence across different regions and environments. This expansion did not draw much attention from the giants of the land, but it created a kind of hidden continuity. While many dominant species would rise and fall, mammals were building a foundation that would allow them to step into new roles when the time came. The story of early mammals is, in many ways, a story about patience and persistence. Success did not come quickly or dramatically. It came through small, steady gains, through the ability to endure and adapt in the background. Even now, traces of this legacy can be seen in the behaviours of modern mammals. The tendency to build nests or burrows, the reliance on learning and memory, the care given to young, and the use of sound and scent for communication all have roots in this deep past. As you picture these animals moving through the undergrowth, pausing to sniff the air, or curling up in a sheltered space as daylight returns, it becomes clear that the Mesozoic was not just a world of giants. It was also a world of small lives, lived carefully and quietly, yet with consequences that would echo far beyond their immediate surroundings. Far from standing still beneath the passage of life, the planet itself was always in motion, turning, tilting, and slowly rearranging its own surface in ways that shaped every forest, shoreline, and ocean basin. During the Mesozoic, the ground under every footstep, claw, and root was part of a larger, restless system, one that moved so slowly it could only be measured in millions of years, yet powerfully enough to rewrite the map of the world. At the beginning of this era, most of the land was still joined together in the vast supercontinent known as Pangaea. From one end of the globe to the other, there were no wide oceans separating familiar shapes of continents. Instead, a single massive stretch of land curved around the planet, bordered by the enormous global ocean of Panthalassa. This arrangement influenced everything from wind patterns to rainfall, from the spread of plants to the routes animals could take as they moved across the landscape. The interior of this supercontinent experienced conditions very different from those along the coasts. With so much land far from the moderating influence of the sea, temperatures swung more sharply between day and night and between seasons. Rainfall was often limited, creating broad dry regions and deserts that stretched across the heart of the landmass. In contrast, the edges of Pangaea, where land met water, tended to be wetter and more temperate, with rivers, wetlands, and forests clustering near the shorelines. Over time, deep within the earth, slow-moving currents in the mantle began to pull this enormous landmass apart. The crust cracked and thinned in places, allowing molten rock to rise and harden, creating new strips of land. These fractures widened into rift valleys and eventually into narrow seas. What started as subtle shifts became, over millions of years, the beginnings of entirely new oceans. As the continents separated, they carried their ecosystems with them. Populations of plants and animals that were once connected found themselves isolated on drifting pieces of land. This separation allowed them to follow different evolutionary paths, adapting to local conditions and developing unique characteristics. The slow movement of the continents became a quiet but powerful driver of diversity. This constant rearrangement also changed the way the planet handled heat. Ocean currents shifted as new seaways opened and old ones closed. Warm water could flow into regions that had once been cooler, and cold currents could reach areas that had been warm. These changes influenced weather patterns, shaping where rain fell and where dry conditions persisted. Seasons during the Mesozoic followed the same basic cause they do today: the tilt of the Earth's axis. As the planet orbited the Sun, different parts of the surface received varying amounts of sunlight at different times of year. However, the overall climate tended to be warmer and more even than what we experience now, especially during certain periods when polar ice was minimal or absent. This warmth meant that seasonal changes often expressed themselves more through patterns of rainfall than through dramatic swings in temperature. In many regions, wet and dry seasons defined the rhythm of life. Plants timed their growth and reproduction to periods of reliable moisture. Animals followed these changes, moving toward areas where food and water were most abundant. In river valleys and low-lying plains, the wet season could transform the landscape. Rivers overflowed their banks, spreading water and sediment across wide areas. These floods enriched the soil, creating fertile ground for plants to grow once the waters receded. The resulting burst of vegetation attracted herbivores, which in turn drew predators, creating temporary centres of activity that pulsed with life. Dry seasons brought a different set of challenges. Water sources shrank, and animals were forced to travel farther to find what they needed. Some species developed behaviours that allowed them to cope, such as burrowing, becoming less active during the hottest parts of the day, or migrating to regions with more reliable resources. These patterns of movement connected distant parts of the landscape, carrying seeds, nutrients, and genetic material across wide areas. Storms added another layer of change. Warm temperatures and wide, shallow seas created conditions that could fuel powerful weather systems. Strong winds and heavy rains reshaped coastlines, eroded cliffs, and deposited new layers of sand and mud in low-lying areas. These events could destroy habitats in one place, while creating new ones in another. Along the coasts, storms sometimes pushed seawater far inland, flooding forests and plains with salt water. While destructive in the short term, these incursions also left behind minerals and nutrients that influenced plant growth once the water retreated. In this way, even violent weather played a role in renewing the land. Volcanoes were another source of both destruction and creation. As the continents split and moved, volcanic activity increased in many regions. Lava flows covered large areas, wiping out existing life, but also creating fresh, mineral-rich surfaces. Over time, plants colonized these new lands, followed by animals, building new ecosystems from the ground up. The gases released by volcanic eruptions affected the atmosphere as well. Carbon dioxide levels could rise, contributing to warming trends. Ash and sulfur compounds sometimes blocked sunlight, leading to temporary cooling. These shifts influenced climate patterns, sometimes over large areas and long periods. The oceans responded to these changes in their own way. Sea levels rose and fell as the volume of water in the oceans changed, and as the shape of the ocean basin shifted. When sea levels were high, shallow seas flooded large parts of the continents, creating broad marine environments where land had once been. When sea levels dropped, these areas were exposed again, turning into plains and valleys. Each of these phases created different conditions for life. Shallow seas supported rich marine ecosystems and provided new coastlines where land and sea life interacted closely. Exposed land offered new territory for plants and animals to move into, often creating corridors that allowed species to spread between regions. The movement of the continents also influenced the height and placement of mountain ranges. As land masses collided or slid past one another, the crust folded and rose, creating chains of hills and mountains. These features affected local climates by altering wind and rainfall patterns. One side of a range might receive abundant rain, while the other lay in a rain shadow, remaining dry. Mountains also served as barriers to movement. Populations of animals and plants on one side could become isolated from those on the other, further encouraging diversification. Rivers that originated in these highlands carried minerals and sediment downstream, shaping valleys and deltas and influencing the fertility of distant lands. Even the rotation of the planet played a role in shaping weather patterns. The Coriolis effect, caused by the Earth's spin, influenced the direction of winds and ocean currents. These large-scale movements helped distribute heat around the globe, connecting distant regions through invisible pathways of air and water. The result of all these interacting systems was a planet that never truly settled into a fixed state. Landscapes changed not just over millions of years, but season by season and storm by storm. A forest could be transformed into a wetland after a series of floods. A coastline could retreat or advance with shifting sea levels. A plain could become more fertile or more barren depending on changes in climate and water flow. Animals and plants lived within this dynamic backdrop, constantly adjusting to new conditions. Some species thrived in stable environments, while others were better suited to change, able to move, adapt, or take advantage of newly created habitats. This difference in flexibility often determined which lineages persisted through periods of environmental stress. Migration became an important strategy for many animals. Following the availability of food and water, they moved across large areas, linking different regions through their travels. These movements helped spread seeds and nutrients, connecting ecosystems that might otherwise remain isolated. For plants, the shifting continents and changing climates created opportunities and challenges. Some species spread widely, following favourable conditions as land masses drifted into new climate zones. Others became confined to smaller areas, adapting to very specific environments. The timing of flowering, leaf growth, and seed production often aligned with seasonal patterns. A wet season might trigger a burst of growth and reproduction, while a dry season could bring a period of dormancy. These rhythms synchronized the lives of plants with those of the animals that depended on them. Insects, too, responded to these cycles. Many species timed their life stages to coincide with the availability of food or favourable weather. This coordination further tied together the fates of different parts of the ecosystem, creating a network of dependencies that stretched across the landscape. The idea of a restless planet is not just about dramatic events like earthquakes or eruptions. It is also about the slow, persistent processes that operate in the background. The gradual drift of a continent, the steady erosion of a mountain, the slow build-up of sediment in a river delta, all contribute to long-term change. These processes leave their marks in the rock record. Layers of sandstone, limestone, and shale tell stories of ancient deserts, seas, and swamps. Fossils embedded within these layers reveal which organisms lived in each environment, offering glimpses into how life responded to shifting conditions. By reading these layers, scientists can reconstruct patterns of climate change, sea level fluctuations, and continental movement. This work shows that the Mesozoic was not a single, uniform period, but a sequence of different worlds, each shaped by the ongoing dance between the Earth's interior and its surface. One of the most striking aspects of this era is how interconnected everything was. A change deep within the planet could eventually influence life on the surface. A shift in ocean currents could alter weather patterns far inland. The growth of a forest could affect the flow of a river, which in turn could shape a coastline. These connections mean that no part of the system existed in isolation. The fate of a small burrowing mammal might be influenced by the movement of a tectonic plate. the distribution of a flowering plant could depend on the rise of a mountain range. The success of a marine predator could be tied to the flow of nutrients from a distant river. Through all of this, time provided the scale on which these changes became meaningful. A single storm might reshape a riverbank, but millions of storms could carve a canyon. A single generation of plants might adjust to a dry season, but thousands of generations could spread across a continent as it drifted into a new climate zone. The planet's restlessness created both stability and uncertainty. While the basic processes of plate movement, weather, and seasonal cycles continued, their specific outcomes varied from place to place and from one period to another. This mix of predictability and change created a world that was challenging but also full of opportunity for life. For the large animals that moved across plains and forests, these shifts could mean changes in migration routes, feeding grounds, and breeding sites. For the smaller, hidden creatures, it could mean the opening or closing of burrows, the appearance or disappearance of food sources, or the need to explore new territories. The oceans, too, were shaped by these forces. The opening of new seaways allowed marine species to spread into previously isolated basins. The closing of old passages could trap populations, leading to unique forms developing in relative isolation. Changes in sea level could expand or shrink shallow marine habitats, influencing the distribution of reefs and coastal ecosystems. Over the long span of the Mesozoic, these patterns repeated again and again, creating a complex mosaic of environments across the planet. Each region followed its own trajectory, influenced by local geography and global processes. From a distant perspective, this constant motion gives the impression of a living planet, one that is not just a stage for life, but an active participant in its story. The shifting continents, changing climates, and evolving landscapes all played roles in shaping which forms of life appeared, thrived, and eventually disappeared. As this era moved toward its later stages, the pace of change did not slow. New plant communities spread. Animal groups continued to diversify. The arrangement of land and sea approached something closer to the modern world, though still quite different in detail. The sense of a planet always on the move, always adjusting, provides a backdrop for everything that follows. It reminds us that the lives of individual creatures, no matter how large or small, are part of a much larger system that operates on scales far beyond any single lifetime. Morning did not arrive in the Mesozoic with a sense of ceremony. There were no bells, no signals, no shared understanding that a new day had officially begun. Light simply spread across the land, slowly revealing shapes that had been present all along. In that growing clarity, the routines of survival resumed, as they had countless times before, guided by hunger, caution, memory, and the quiet understanding of what it took to make it through another cycle of sun and shadow. For plant eaters, the first priority was often food. Large herbivorous dinosaurs moved early, taking advantage of cooler temperatures before the heat of the day set in. Their bodies, heavy and warm, were more comfortable in the mild air of morning. As they travelled, they followed routes shaped by habit and by the landscape itself. Riverbanks, open plains near forests, and the edges of wetlands became familiar paths, used generation after generation. These animals rarely moved alone. Many species travelled in groups, sometimes small family units, sometimes larger herds that stretched across wide areas. The presence of others offered protection. A predator approaching a single animal might succeed, but facing a cluster of large, alert bodies increased the risk of injury. Even for the biggest hunters, a broken tooth or damaged limb could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Within these herds, there was a constant flow of information. Movements, posture, and sound all played a role in communication. A sudden pause, a raised head, or a low call could signal unease. Younger animals learned by watching older ones, following their lead when it came to where to go and when to stop. Feeding itself was a slow, steady process. Many herbivorous dinosaurs spent hours each day eating, stripping leaves from branches, pulling fronds from tall ferns, or tearing at low-growing plants. Their teeth and jaws were built for this work, and their digestive systems were adapted to handle tough, fibrous material. Inside their bodies, complex systems of fermentation broke down plant matter, releasing the energy stored within. As they fed, these animals reshaped the landscape. Trees were pruned, shrubs were flattened, open spaces appeared where there had once been dense growth. Over time, this activity influenced which plants thrived and which struggled. Areas visited regularly by large herbivores often became mosaics of different vegetation types, supporting a wider variety of smaller animals and insects. Predators watched these changes carefully. Carnivorous dinosaurs did not wander aimlessly. They learned the patterns of their prey, the places where herds gathered, the times of day when animals were most vulnerable. River crossings, narrow valleys, and the edges of forests became key locations, where prey movement was predictable and escape routes were limited. A hunt was rarely a simple chase. Many predators relied on patience and positioning rather than speed alone. They used cover, staying low and still until the right moment. When they moved, it was often in a burst of energy, closing the distance quickly to prevent their target from reacting. Some species may have hunted in pairs or small groups, coordinating their actions to confuse or surround prey. This kind of behaviour requires communication and an understanding of roles within the group. While direct evidence of such strategies is difficult to find in the fossil record, trackways and certain bone arrangements suggest that cooperation may have played a part in the lives of some carnivores. Not every hunt ended in success. Failed attempts were common, and predators had to manage their energy carefully. Chasing a large, healthy herbivore over a long distance could be costly, leaving a hunter exhausted and vulnerable. Choosing when and what to hunt was as important as the act itself. Smaller predators and scavengers filled another role in this world. They fed on animals that died from illness, injury, or old age, cleaning up what was left behind. This activity helped recycle nutrients back into the ecosystem, supporting plant growth and the many small creatures that lived in the soil and water. Scavenging was not without its own risks. A carcass could attract multiple animals, including larger predators. Approaching such a site required caution and timing, often waiting until the most dangerous competitors had moved on. For the young of any species, survival depended heavily on the protection of adults. Nesting sites were chosen carefully, often in areas that offered some form of cover, such as dense vegetation, raised ground, or proximity to water. Eggs and hatchlings were vulnerable to a wide range of threats, from small mammals and reptiles to larger dinosaurs that might stumble upon a nest by chance. Some dinosaurs returned to the same nesting grounds year after year, creating colonies where many individuals laid eggs in close proximity. This behaviour could provide safety in numbers. A predator approaching a large nesting site would be noticed more quickly, and the combined response of many adults could be enough to drive it away. Once hatched, young animals faced a steep learning curve. They had to figure out what to eat, how to move safely through their environment, and how to recognise danger. Staying close to adults increased their chances of making it through this vulnerable period. Play-like behaviour may have helped in this process. Running, sparring and exploring allowed young dinosaurs to practice the movements and skills they would need later in life. These activities also helped establish social bonds within a group, creating connections that could be important for future cooperation. Daily life was shaped not just by interactions between animals, but also by the rhythms of the environment. Temperature changes influenced when animals were active. In warmer regions, many creatures rested during the hottest parts of the day, seeking shade or shelter. Activity picked up again in the late afternoon and evening when the air cooled. Water sources were central to these routines. Rivers, lakes, and wetlands drew animals from wide areas, especially during dry periods. These locations became hubs of activity, where different species crossed paths. For predators, these were prime hunting grounds. For prey, they were necessary but dangerous places where caution was always required. The presence of water also supported plant growth, creating greener areas that stood out against drier surroundings. These patches of vegetation provided both food and cover, influencing where animals chose to spend their time. Weather added another layer of unpredictability. Sudden storms could flood low-lying areas, forcing animals to move to higher ground. Heavy rain could soften the soil, making travel more difficult and leaving deep tracks behind. Wind could carry scents and sounds farther than usual, altering how animals detected each other. Over longer periods, seasonal changes reshaped daily routines. In regions with distinct wet and dry seasons, the availability of food and water varied throughout the year. Some animals migrated following the rains or the growth of new vegetation. Others adapted by changing their diets or activity patterns. The structure of the land itself influenced how animals moved and lived. Forests offered cover and a variety of food sources, but limited visibility. Open plains provided space to see danger from a distance, but little shelter. Mountains and hills created barriers and pathways, guiding the flow of movement across the landscape. Insects played a role in this daily drama as well. Swarms of biting or stinging insects could drive animals away from certain areas at particular times of year. At the same time, insects provided a rich food source for smaller animals, linking the smallest and largest forms of life in the ecosystem. Social interactions were not limited to cooperation and competition for food. Mating behaviours added their own complexity. Displays of colour, movement, or sound likely played a part in attracting partners. Some dinosaurs had crests, horns, or other features that may have been used in these interactions, signalling strength, health, or suitability. These displays could also lead to conflict. Rival animals might compete for access to mates or territory, engaging in physical contests or visual standoffs. While such encounters could be dangerous, they also helped establish hierarchies within groups, reducing the need for constant fighting. Territory itself was an important concept for many species. Certain areas offered better access to food, water, or nesting sites. Defending these spaces could improve an animal's chances of survival and reproduction. Scent marking, vocal calls, and physical presence all played roles in maintaining these boundaries. The quieter members of the ecosystem, such as early mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, navigated this larger world carefully. They often timed their activities to avoid peak periods of dinosaur movement. Night offered a window of opportunity when many large animals were less active. These smaller creatures found food in the form of insects, seeds, and leftover scraps. They used burrows, logs, and dense vegetation as cover. Their movements were quick and deliberate, minimizing the time spent in open areas. Even plants were part of the daily cycle. Leaves opened and closed in response to light and moisture. Flowers, where present, produced nectar and pollen at specific times to attract pollinators. Seeds ripened and fell, becoming food for animals or the beginnings of new plants. Fire, whether sparked by lightning or volcanic activity, occasionally swept through parts of the landscape. While destructive, these events also created open spaces where new growth could take hold. Animals responded by moving away from burned areas and returning later to take advantage of fresh vegetation. The sounds of this world changed throughout the day. Morning might bring the calls of certain animals, the buzz of insects warming in the sun, and the rustle of feeding herds. Midday could be quieter, with many creatures resting. Evening and night introduced a different set of noises, from the movements of nocturnal animals to the distant calls of predators. Smell was another constant presence. The scent of plants, water, animals, and even the soil itself provided information. Predators tracked prey by scent. Animals recognized familiar individuals and marked territories. The air carried these chemical messages across distances, connecting different parts of the landscape in an invisible web. The idea of surviving in this world did not mean constant struggle in every moment. There were long periods of relative calm when animals fed, rested and moved without immediate threat. These times allowed for growth, reproduction, and the continuation of daily routines. Yet the potential for danger was always present. A sudden movement in the trees, a shadow passing over the ground, or a change in the behaviour of other animals could signal trouble. Staying alert was part of life, woven into every action. The long-term success of a species depended on how well it balanced these demands. Those that were too cautious might miss opportunities to feed or reproduce. Those that were too bold might fall victim to predators or injury. Finding the right balance was an ongoing process, shaped by the environment and by the actions of other species. Across generations, these daily patterns influenced evolution. Traits that improved survival in this particular mix of hunting, herding, and environmental change became more common. Over time, this shaped the forms and behaviours that we now see in the fossil record. It is easy to focus on dramatic moments, a chase, a confrontation, a sudden storm, but most of life in the Mesozoic was made up of ordinary repeating actions: eating, walking, resting, watching. These simple activities, carried out across vast spans of time by countless individuals, created the larger patterns we recognise today. The land itself bore the marks of these routines. Paths worn into the ground by repeated movement, areas of vegetation kept low by constant feeding, nesting sites reused year after year. These physical traces became part of the landscape, influencing how future animals moved and lived. As the day faded and the light softened, many of the larger animals settled into resting places. Some stood, others lay down. Smaller creatures emerged from hiding, beginning their own rounds of foraging and exploration. The cycle continued, largely unchanged in its basic form, even as the details shifted from place to place and era to era. Holding this picture of daily life, of countless small decisions and interactions playing out under a wide, changing sky, it becomes clear that the Mesozoic world was not defined only by its most famous inhabitants. It was defined by the constant, layered activity of everything that lived within it, from the smallest insect to the largest dinosaur. As daylight loosened its hold on the land and the last thin line of the sun slipped behind distant hills or forest canopies, the Mesozoic world did not fall silent. Instead, it shifted. The familiar shapes of the day softened into outlines and shadows, and the air itself seemed to change character, carrying new signals, new movements, and new possibilities. Darkness did not mean rest for everything. It meant a different kind of activity, guided less by sight and more by sound, scent, and memory. Without artificial light, night arrived fully and completely. There were no glowing horizons, no distant lamps, no windows spilling warmth into the dark. The sky became a deep field of stars, unbroken by anything but clouds and the slow path of the moon. On clear nights, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens in a pale, hazy band, a reminder of how small the world below was compared to the vastness above. On the ground, the change was immediate. Temperatures dropped, sometimes quickly, especially in open areas and deserts where the heat of the day escaped into the sky. In forests and wetlands, the cooling was more gradual, buffered by vegetation and water. This shift in temperature alone was enough to alter the behaviour of many animals. Creatures that had been active in the warmth of daylight slowed or settled into resting places, while others, built for cooler conditions, began to emerge. The first signs of night were often subtle. A rustle in the undergrowth, the soft movement of leaves as something small passed through, the faint splash of water near a riverbank. These sounds did not carry far, but in the stillness of evening they stood out more clearly. Insects were among the most noticeable contributors to the nighttime soundscape. Different species became active as the light faded, filling the air with chirps, buzzes, and soft rhythmic calls. Some of these sounds were meant to attract mates. Others served as warnings or simple byproducts of movement and flight. Together they created a kind of shifting background that changed from place to place and hour to hour. Early mammals found their moment in this world of shadow. Their bodies, insulated by fur and powered by warm-blooded metabolisms, allowed them to remain active when many reptiles became sluggish. They moved cautiously, noses close to the ground or the air, whiskers brushing against roots, stones and fallen branches. Every step was measured, every pause a chance to listen. Smell played a central role in their lives. Scents lingered long after the source had passed through an area. A predator's trail, the presence of another mammal, the location of food, all could be detected through faint chemical traces in the air or on the ground. This invisible layer of information turned the landscape into a kind of map, one that could be read without ever seeing what lay ahead. The ground itself held a memory of the day. Warmth stored in rocks and soil was slowly released into the night air. In some places, this created gentle currents that carried smells upward or along the surface. Animals learned to use these patterns, positioning themselves downwind of likely prey or away from the scent of danger. Water sources became especially important after dark. Rivers, ponds and wetlands attracted a wide range of creatures, both those seeking a drink and those looking for food. The sounds here were often louder and more varied. Frogs and other amphibians called from the edges. Insects hovered above the surface. Fish and aquatic reptiles moved just below, occasionally breaking the water with a ripple or a splash. For predators, these gathering places offered opportunities. Waiting in cover, they could listen for the approach of prey, or watch for movement against the lighter surface of the water. The contrast between dark shapes and pale reflections made it easier to spot motion, even in low light. Above the ground, the air held its own set of movements. Flying animals, including early birds and pterosaurs, sometimes took advantage of cooler nighttime air to travel or hunt. Their silhouettes passed silently against the stars or the moon, brief shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. The moon itself was a powerful presence in this world. Its light, though soft compared to the sun, could transform the landscape. On bright nights, open areas became visible enough for animals to move with more confidence. Shadow sharpened, and the outlines of trees, rocks and hills stood out clearly. Some creatures likely timed their activities to the lunar cycle. Brighter nights could mean greater risk of being seen, but also better visibility for finding food or navigating unfamiliar terrain. Darker nights offered more cover, but made movement more uncertain. The sky was not always calm. Clouds could gather and obscure the stars and moon, plunging the world into deeper darkness. Storms sometimes rolled in during the night, bringing wind and rain that reshaped the soundscape. Leaves and branches rattled. Water drummed against the ground. Thunder echoed across plains and forests, a deep, rolling presence that could be felt as much as heard. Rain changed the way the world smelled. Dry dust and plant matter released new scents as they became wet. The air filled with the earthy smell of soil and vegetation. For animals that relied on scent, this could be both helpful and confusing, masking some trails while revealing others. The forest at night felt different in ways that went beyond sight and sound. The canopy, which during the day filtered sunlight, now blocked what little moonlight there was, creating pockets of deeper shadow. Moving through these spaces required careful navigation. Branches, vines, and uneven ground posed constant obstacles. In these darker areas, touch became more important. Animals brushed against leaves and bark, feeling their way forward. The texture of surfaces, the resistance of roots underfoot, and the slight give of soil all provided information about where it was safe to step. Some predators specialized in using the cover of night to their advantage. Their senses were tuned to detect the smallest movement or sound. A faint rustle in the leaves or a soft exhale could be enough to trigger a response. These hunters often moved slowly, conserving energy and relying on surprise rather than speed. Not all nocturnal activity was about hunting. Many animals used the night to travel longer distances, avoiding the heat of the day and the presence of larger, more dominant species. Migration routes that crossed open plains or dry regions were safer under the cover of darkness. Communication also took on different forms after sunset. Calls and vocalizations could carry farther in the cooler, denser air. Some animals used specific sounds to locate each other or to signal territory. Others relied more on scent marking, leaving chemical messages that could be read hours or even days later. Insects contributed to this nighttime network of communication as well. Bioluminescent species, where present, produce small points of light in the darkness. These glows were used to attract mates or to confuse predators. Against the deep background of the night, even a tiny flash of light could be visible from a surprising distance. The ground-dwelling reptiles that had been active during the day often found shelter for the night. Some retreated into burrows or under rocks. Others remained out in the open, relying on camouflage and stillness to avoid detection. Their body temperatures dropped as the air cooled, slowing their movements and conserving energy. Larger dinosaurs, depending on their size and physiology, may have remained partially active or settled into periods of rest. Finding a safe place to stop for the night was important. Open areas allowed for better visibility, reducing the chance of being surprised by a predator. Forest edges provided cover but also limited sightlines. Herds often stayed together, forming clusters that offered some protection. The presence of many bodies created a shared barrier, making it harder for a predator to approach unnoticed. Within these groups, individuals took turns being more alert, lifting their heads or shifting position in response to sounds or scents. The experience of time itself felt different at night. Without the visual cues of the sun's movement, hours blended together. The passing of time was marked instead by changes in sound, temperature, and the position of stars. For animals attuned to these signals, the sky became a clock, its slow rotation providing a steady reference point. The smell of the night was layered and complex. Plants released different compounds in the cooler air, sometimes as a way to attract nighttime pollinators. Flowering plants, where present, opened or produced stronger scents after dark, drawing insects that were active in low light. This connection between plants and nocturnal insects created a quieter version of the daytime pollination network. Moths and other night-flying insects moved between flowers, carrying pollen and contributing to the spread of vegetation. These interactions were easy to overlook, but they played an important role in shaping plant communities. Along the edges of forests and wetlands, the boundary between different habitats became especially active at night. Animals from both sides met in these transitional zones, creating a mix of species that did not often interact during the day. This overlap increased competition and opportunity at the same time. Predators that specialized in hunting at night learned to use these edges. The movement of prey between open and covered areas created predictable patterns. Waiting in the right spot at the right time could yield a meal with less effort than chasing across a wide plain. The deeper night, when the moon was high or hidden behind clouds, often brought a lull. Some animals settled into rest. Others remained alert but moved less, conserving energy. This rhythm of activity and stillness created a pulsing pattern across the landscape, one that repeated night after night. Even the soil was active after dark. Earthworms and other small creatures emerged to feed on organic matter. Their movements helped mix the soil, improving its structure and nutrient content. This quiet work supported plant growth, linking the smallest nocturnal activities to the broader health of the ecosystem. In wetlands, the night brought a chorus of amphibians. Their calls served both as invitations to mates and as declarations of territory. These sounds could be loud and persistent, filling the air and carrying across water and land. The pattern of calls often shifted with the seasons, reflecting changes in temperature and rainfall. The presence of water also influenced how sound travelled. Over smooth surfaces, noises could carry farther. A splash or a call might be heard at a distance, alerting animals that would not have noticed the same sound in a dense forest. The stars overhead provided more than just light. For some animals, the patterns of the sky may have helped with navigation. The steady movement of constellations offered a reference for direction, especially in open areas where landmarks were few. The night sky during the Mesozoic would have looked slightly different from today's, as the positions of stars changed slowly over long periods. Still, the basic experience of looking up into a wide, glittering field of light would have been familiar, connecting that ancient world to the present in a quiet, shared moment. There is a certain stillness that comes with imagining this deep past after dark. The sense that the world has narrowed to a smaller, more intimate scale. Sounds are closer. Movements are more careful. The vastness of the day gives way to the closeness of the night. For early mammals, this was a time of opportunity. They explored, foraged, and interacted in a world that felt less dominated by the giants of the land. Their lives, though small in physical scale, were rich in detail and constant adjustment. For insects and plants, the night offered a different set of connections, linking species through scent and movement in low light. For predators, it was a time to rely on senses sharpened by darkness. The idea of after dark in the Mesozoic is not just about a lack of light, it is about a shift in priorities and strategies. The same landscape, the same rivers, forests and plains, became a different world when seen through the lens of sound and smell instead of sight. This dual nature of the planet, one face for the day and another for the night, added depth to every ecosystem. Animals and plants did not just occupy space, they occupied time, fitting their lives into specific hours and conditions that suited their needs. Over long periods, these daily and nightly rhythms influenced evolution. Traits that improved survival in darkness or low light became more common in species that relied on the night. Those that depended on daytime activity developed different sets of adaptations. This division of time helped reduce direct competition and allowed more forms of life to coexist in the same areas. The night also provided a kind of buffer. By spreading activity across different times, ecosystems could support more species than if everything happened at once. This temporal separation became another way that life diversified and found room to grow. As the hours passed, and the sky slowly began to lighten again, the world prepared for another transition. Nocturnal creatures retreated to shelter. Daytime animals began to stir. The cycle, so simple in concept yet so rich in detail, repeated itself. It becomes clear that even in an era remembered for its giants, much of life's story was written in soft sounds, faint scents, and careful steps taken in the shadows. And as the first hints of light returned to the horizon, revealing the familiar shapes of land and water once more, the planet continued its steady turning, ready to show yet another side of itself, one shaped not by darkness or light alone, but by the long, layered processes that would soon bring fire from the earth and changes in climate that touched every corner of this ancient world. Deep beneath every forest, plain, and ocean basin, forces were at work that no animal could see and no plant could sense directly, yet their influence reached all the way to the surface and into the air itself. The Mesozoic world was not only shaped by sunlight, rain, and living things, but by heat and motion rising from the planet's interior, a slow, powerful system that breathed through cracks in the crust and at times released its presence in dramatic and unmistakable ways. The Earth's outer shell, the solid ground that seems so permanent underfoot, is made up of large, moving pieces known as tectonic plates. These plates float on a softer, hotter layer of rock below them, shifting and sliding over spans of millions of years. Where they pull apart, magma rises to fill the gap. Where they collide, one plate may sink beneath another, melting as it descends and feeding new volcanic systems. These processes were especially active during the Mesozoic, as the great supercontinent of Pangaea began to break apart and new oceans formed between drifting land masses. Volcanoes were one of the most visible expressions of this hidden motion. In some regions, they stood as tall cones rising above the surrounding landscape. In others, they did not form a single mountain at all, but spread across wide areas as long cracks in the ground, releasing lava that flowed outward in sheets. These eruptions could last for years, decades, or even longer, slowly covering the land with layer after layer of molten rock that cooled into dark, solid stone. The immediate impact of an eruption was often destructive. Lava burned through forests, buried rivers, and erased entire habitats. Ash fell from the sky, coating leaves, water, and soil in fine grey dust. The air filled with the sharp scent of sulphur and other gases, making breathing difficult for animals caught nearby. Many living things had to flee or perish, leaving behind empty spaces in the landscape. Yet these same events also carried the seeds of renewal. The rock formed from cooled lava was rich in minerals. Over time, as wind and rain broke it down, it became fertile soil. Plants began to grow on these new surfaces, often in thick, fast-spreading patches. Insects followed, then small animals, and eventually larger ones. What had once been a barren black field of stone turned into a fresh, living environment. Some of the largest volcanic events of the Mesozoic did not take the form of single, dramatic explosions. Instead, they appeared as vast regions of lava flows, known today as large igneous provinces. These were areas where enormous amounts of magma reached the surface over relatively short geological periods, covering hundreds of thousands or even millions of square kilometers. One such event occurred near the beginning of the Mesozoic, around the time when the first dinosaurs were beginning to spread. The eruptions associated with the breakup of Pangaea released huge volumes of lava and gas. This activity may have contributed to changes in climate and ocean chemistry, influencing which species survived and which struggled during this transitional period. The gases released by volcanoes did not simply vanish into the sky. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other compounds entered the atmosphere and interacted with sunlight, clouds, and water vapor. Carbon dioxide is particularly important because it traps heat, helping to warm the planet. When large amounts of it are released, global temperatures can rise. During parts of the Mesozoic, high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere contributed to a generally warm climate. Polar regions that are icy today supported forests and other plant life. Sea levels were often higher, as warmer temperatures caused water to expand and reduced the amount of ice locked up at the poles. Sulfur compounds, on the other hand, can have a cooling effect in the short term. When sulfur dioxide enters the atmosphere, it can form tiny particles that reflect sunlight back into space. After major eruptions, this can lead to temporary drops in temperature and changes in weather patterns. The balance between warming and cooling effects depended on the scale and timing of volcanic activity. These atmospheric changes did not stay confined to one place. Winds carried gases and particles around the globe, spreading their influence far from the original eruption sites. In this way, a volcanic event in one region could affect climates and ecosystems thousands of kilometers away. The oceans also felt the impact. Carbon dioxide from the air dissolves into seawater, forming carbonic acid. This process can change the chemistry of the ocean, making it more difficult for certain organisms such as reef builders and shell-forming animals to create and maintain their hard structures. Periods of intense volcanic activity may have placed stress on these marine communities, altering the balance of life in shallow seas and reefs. At the same time, volcanic ash falling into the ocean introduced nutrients like iron and phosphorus. These elements can stimulate the growth of plankton, the tiny organisms at the base of the marine food web. When plankton populations increased, they provided more food for fish and other animals, potentially boosting the productivity of entire ecosystems. This combination of stress and support created a complex picture. Some species struggled, while others found new opportunities. The overall effect depended on local conditions, the timing of eruptions, and the ability of organisms to adapt. The idea of the Earth breathing through volcanoes is not just a metaphor. The exchange of gases between the planet's interior, the atmosphere, and the oceans is a real and ongoing process. Over long periods, this exchange helps regulate the planet's climate, keeping it within ranges that can support life. Plants played an important role in this system. Through photosynthesis, they absorbed carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen. When plants died and were buried, some of that carbon became locked away in sediments, removing it from the atmosphere for long stretches of time. This process helped counterbalance the carbon dioxide released by volcanoes. During the Mesozoic, the spread of new plant groups, including flowering plants, may have influenced this balance. As plant communities changed and expanded, the rates at which carbon was absorbed and stored also changed, contributing to long-term climate trends. The movement of continents affected this system as well. As land masses drifted into different climate zones, the types of vegetation they supported changed. A continent moving toward the equator might develop lush tropical forests that absorbed large amounts of carbon dioxide. One drifting toward higher latitudes might support different plant communities with different effects on the atmosphere. Mountain building, often linked to plate movement and volcanic activity, added another layer of interaction. As mountains rose, they influenced rainfall patterns and the flow of rivers. Increased erosion carried minerals into the oceans, affecting marine chemistry and productivity. The exposed rock surfaces also reacted with carbon dioxide in the air, helping to remove it through chemical weathering. All of these processes operated on timescales far longer than the lives of individual animals or plants. A forest might grow and burn down many times over while a mountain range slowly lifted by a few meters. Yet the cumulative effect of these slow changes shaped the world that living things experienced. From the perspective of a dinosaur or an early mammal, the signs of this deep activity might appear as a smoking mountain on the horizon, a field of fresh, dark rock where a forest once stood, or a stretch of coastline that slowly changed shape as the land rose or sank. These were not everyday occurrences, but they were part of the broader context of life on a living planet. Climate patterns during the Mesozoic reflected this interplay between internal and external forces. The general warmth of the era did not mean uniform conditions everywhere. There were still regional differences, with some areas experiencing more rainfall and others remaining dry. Seasonal changes continued, shaped by the tilt of the Earth's axis and the distribution of land and sea. In some periods, evidence suggests that the climate became especially warm, with high sea levels and widespread shallow seas. These conditions created extensive coastal environments and inland waterways, supporting rich ecosystems. In other periods, cooling trends led to the retreat of seas and the expansion of land-based habitats. These shifts influenced where plants and animals could live. A rising sea might flood a low-lying plain, forcing terrestrial species to move to higher ground. A cooling climate might make a region less suitable for tropical plants, opening space for different vegetation types to take hold. Volcanic activity could trigger or amplify these changes. A series of large eruptions might release enough carbon dioxide to push temperatures upward. Conversely, the ash and particles from major events could temporarily cool the climate. The combined effect created a climate system that was dynamic and responsive, capable of shifting in noticeable ways over relatively short geological periods. The breadth of the planet also included the movement of heat through the oceans. Warm water near the equator flowed toward higher latitudes, while cooler water sank and moved back toward the tropics. These currents helped distribute heat around the globe, moderating temperatures and influencing weather patterns on land. As continents drifted and new seaways opened, these ocean currents changed. A narrow passage between two land masses could allow warm water to flow into a region that had previously been cooler, altering the local climate. The closing of a passage could have the opposite effect, cutting off heat and leading to cooling. Life responded to these changes in a variety of ways. Some species migrated following suitable conditions, others adapted to new temperatures, rainfall patterns, or food sources. Those that could not adjust faced decline or extinction, leaving behind empty niches that other organisms might fill. The fossil record preserves signs of these transitions. Changes in the types of plants found in rock layers can indicate shifts in climate. The presence or absence of certain marine organisms can reflect changes in water temperature or chemistry. By reading these clues, scientists can piece together a picture of how the planet's internal activity influenced the surface world. One striking aspect of this long history is how interconnected everything was. A movement deep in the mantle could lead millions of years later to changes in the distribution of forests, the composition of the atmosphere, and the success of certain animal groups. The Earth's interior and its living surface were part of the same system, linked by the flow of energy and matter. This connection gives a different perspective on the idea of stability. The Mesozoic is often described as a time of long-lasting warmth and relative calm compared to some other eras. Yet within that broad frame, there were countless changes, both gradual and abrupt. Stability in this sense did not mean a lack of motion, but a balance between opposing forces. Fire from the earth and the growth of forests, the release of gases and their absorption by plants, the rise of mountains and their slow erosion, all worked together to keep the planet within a range that could support a wide variety of life. For the animals living in this world, these deep processes were part of the background, rarely noticed directly but always present in their effects. A change in rainfall might alter migration routes. A shift in temperature might influence when plants flowered or insects emerged. A new coastline might create feeding grounds or barriers to movement. Even the night sky could reflect these changes. Volcanic ash in the atmosphere could create red or orange sunsets and sunrises, altering the colours of the horizon. Clearer periods might reveal sharper views of the stars. These visual cues, though subtle, were part of the sensory experience of living on a dynamic planet. The long-term impact of volcanic activity and climate change extended beyond the Mesozoic itself. The arrangement of continents, the composition of the atmosphere, and the distribution of ecosystems that emerged during this era set the stage for what came next. The world that followed was built in part on the foundations laid by these deep, fiery processes. Thinking about this can shift the way the Mesozoic is viewed. Instead of a static age defined only by its animals, it becomes a period of ongoing negotiation between the planet's interior and its living surface. Life adapted to the rhythms of a world that was always changing, even when that change was too slow to notice within a single lifetime. The breath of the planet in this sense was a long inhale and exhale of heat, gases and movement, shaping climates, landscapes, and the possibilities available to every living thing. This steady exchange created the conditions under which forests grew, oceans teemed, and animals, both large and small, found their places. Toward the later stretches of the Mesozoic, the planet carried a feeling that is hard to define from any single moment, yet becomes clearer when viewed across long spans of time, a sense of systems leaning slowly and unevenly towards something different. This was not a world collapsing in a single dramatic motion. It was a world adjusting, responding, and reshaping itself through a series of subtle shifts that, taken together, pointed toward a future that would not look like the past. Landscapes that had once seemed stable began to change in their own quiet ways. Coastlines moved as sea levels rose and fell. Shallow seas that had flooded across continents retreated in some regions, exposing new stretches of land. In other places, water advanced, turning low plains into marine environments. These movements created new boundaries between land and sea, boundaries that were often temporary and constantly redefined. As these changes unfolded, plants were among the first to respond. Vegetation patterns shifted with the availability of water, sunlight, and suitable soil. Flowering plants, which had been spreading steadily, became more prominent in many regions. Their ability to grow quickly and reproduce efficiently allowed them to take advantage of newly exposed ground and disturbed areas left by flooding, storms, or volcanic activity. Forests changed in structure as well as in composition. In some areas, dense stands of conifers and cycads gave way to more mixed plant communities, where broad-leaved flowering plants filled the spaces between taller trees. This created a layered landscape, with more variation in plant height and density. Sunlight reached the ground in different patterns, supporting a wider range of smaller plants and the animals that depended on them. These botanical shifts did not happen in isolation. Herbivorous animals, from large dinosaurs to smaller plant eaters, adjusted their feeding habits and movement patterns in response to the changing vegetation. Some species found new food sources in the softer leaves and fruits of flowering plants. Others remained tied to older plant types, limiting where they could live as those plants became less common in certain regions. The ripple effects moved through entire ecosystems. Predators followed their prey into new areas. Insects adapted to new plant partners. Small mammals found new opportunities in the growing diversity of habitats. Each adjustment, no matter how minor it might have seemed at the time, added to the overall sense of a world in transition. Climate patterns also showed signs of change. While the Mesozoic had been generally warm, evidence from rocks, fossils and chemical signatures suggests that temperatures and rainfall became more variable in some periods. Certain regions experienced longer dry spells. Others saw increases in seasonal storms and flooding. These variations placed new pressures on plants and animals that had been adapted to more consistent conditions. The movement of the continents continued to play a role in shaping these patterns. As land masses drifted farther apart, ocean currents shifted. Warm and cold water flowed into different regions, altering local climates. Areas that had once been connected by land bridges became isolated by widening seas. This separation affected the movement of species, limiting where they could travel and leading to regional differences in ecosystems. Isolation often led to specialization. Populations cut off from their relatives elsewhere adapted to local conditions, developing unique traits over time. While this increased diversity in some areas, it also made certain species more vulnerable. A plant or animal that was highly adapted to a narrow set of conditions could struggle if those conditions changed. In the oceans, similar patterns emerged. Shallow seas that had supported rich marine life in earlier periods shrank in some regions as sea levels dropped. Coral reefs and other coastal ecosystems faced changes in water depth, temperature, and chemistry. Some species thrived in the new conditions while others declined. Marine food webs adjusted as well. Changes in plankton populations, driven by shifts in ocean currents and nutrient availability, influenced the abundance of fish and larger predators. These adjustments moved up and down the chain of life, reshaping communities over wide areas. Volcanic activity remained a presence, sometimes intensifying during this time. Large eruptions released gases and ash that affected the atmosphere and oceans. Short-term cooling or warming events could follow, adding to the climate variability that many species were already experiencing. These events didn't act alone, but combined with ongoing changes in land and sea to create a complex, shifting environment. The skies too reflected this period of transition. Flying animals continued to diversify. Birds became more widespread, taking on roles that pterosaurs had once dominated in some regions. This shift did not happen everywhere at once, but it marked a gradual change in how the air above the land was used and shared. On the ground, dinosaur communities showed signs of change as well. In some areas, certain groups became less common while others expanded. Fossil records reveal patterns of turnover, where one set of species disappears from a region and another takes its place. These changes suggest that the balance of ecosystems was being tested and reshaped. Not every region experienced these shifts in the same way. Some areas remained relatively stable for long stretches, while others went through rapid cycles of change. This patchwork of conditions created a world where life had to be flexible, ready to move adapt, or find new strategies for survival. The concept of a long goodbye fits this period because the changes were drawn out and layered. There was no single moment when the old world ended and a new one began. Instead, there were many small endings and beginnings, overlapping and interwoven across millions of years. For the animals living through this time, these shifts would have been experienced as changes in daily life rather than as a grand narrative. A familiar feeding ground might slowly dry out. A forest might become more open. A coastline might move farther away. These were practical concerns, addressed through movement, altered behaviour, or changes in diet. Young animals born into these conditions would grow up in a slightly different world than their parents had known. Over generations, these differences accumulated, shaping new forms and behaviours that reflected the changing environment. Small creatures such as mammals and insects often found ways to take advantage of the growing complexity of the landscape. The spread of flowering plants and the creation of new habitat types offered niches that could be filled by adaptable, fast-reproducing species. These groups expanded quietly, building their own networks of relationships alongside the larger, more visible animals. The soil itself recorded these changes. Layers of sediment built up in river deltas, floodplains, and shallow seas. Each layer captured a snapshot of the environment at the time it was formed, preserving pollen, plant fragments, shells, and bones. Together, these layers form a long archive of the planet's shifting conditions. Scientists studying these records see patterns that suggest increasing variability toward the end of the Mesozoic. Fluctuations in temperature, sea level, and species diversity point to a system that was being pushed in different directions by multiple forces at once. The oceans, in particular, show signs of stress in some periods. Changes in water chemistry, possibly linked to volcanic activity and shifts in circulation, affected the ability of certain organisms to build shells or skeletons. Reef systems, which depend on stable conditions, appear to have faced challenges in some regions. On land, the distribution of plants and animals became more uneven. Some areas supported lush, diverse communities, while others grew more sparse. This unevenness created corridors of movement and barriers to travel, influencing how species spread and interacted. Predator-prey relationships also evolved under these changing conditions. When a herbivore species declined in a region, predators that depended on it had to adjust, either by shifting to different prey or by moving to new areas. These changes could cascade through the food web, affecting multiple species at once. The sense of a world on the edge of change is reinforced by the way these different processes overlapped. Continental drift altered geography. Climate variability influenced habitats. Volcanic activity affected atmosphere and oceans. Biological innovations, such as the spread of flowering plants and the rise of birds, reshaped ecosystems from within. None of these forces acted alone. Their combined effects created a complex, dynamic environment where stability and disruption existed side by side. In some places, life continued much as it had for millions of years. In others, conditions shifted enough to favour new groups and disadvantage others. The idea of resilience becomes important here. Many species were able to persist through these changes, adapting to new conditions or finding refuges where the old ways of living still worked. Others were less flexible, tied closely to specific environments or resources that became less reliable. The long-term outcome of this period was not immediately obvious. From within the flow of daily life, the changes might have seemed manageable, even minor. It's only when viewed across the vast scale of geological time that the broader trend becomes visible. The planet itself continued its steady processes, breathing through volcanoes, reshaping its surface through plate movement, and cycling water and air through atmosphere and oceans. Life, in turn, continued to respond, experiment and adjust. The sky above still carried the same stars, rivers still flowed toward the sea, forests still grew, though their composition and structure were changing. Animals still followed their routines of feeding, resting, and raising young. In many ways, the world felt familiar, even as the foundations beneath that familiarity were shifting. This period of transition also highlights the interconnectedness of different parts of the system. A change in ocean currents could influence climate on land. A shift in plant communities could alter animal behaviour. A volcanic eruption could affect both air and water. These links meant that change in one place often led to change elsewhere, sometimes in unexpected ways. The growing presence of birds and mammals added another layer of complexity. These groups, often more adaptable in behaviour and diet, began to occupy roles that would become more prominent later. Their increasing diversity hinted at possibilities that extended beyond the existing order. The large dinosaurs, still present and often dominant, were part of this evolving picture. Some groups continued to thrive, while others showed signs of decline in certain regions. The reasons for these patterns are still studied and debated, but they reflect the broader theme of a world in flux. The sense of a goodbye does not mean that everything was fading at once. It means that the familiar arrangement of life and environment was gradually giving way to something else. The process was slow, uneven, and complex, involving both losses and gains. For the planet, this was not an ending, but another phase in a long story of change. The conditions that supported one set of ecosystems were shifting toward those that would support another. The transition was not smooth, but it was continuous. The Mesozoic was not a static age defined only by its most famous creatures. It was a living system in motion, always responding to the interplay of forces from deep within the Earth and far beyond its atmosphere. In the final stretch of the Mesozoic, the world carried forward all of its familiar rhythms, the turning of days into nights, the slow movement of herds across plains, the quiet work of plants drawing light and water into living tissue, and the steady circulation of air and ocean that linked distant regions into a single connected system. Nothing in these everyday patterns would have suggested that a moment of profound disruption was approaching, one that would leave a clear line in the planet's history and reshape the future of life in ways no creature alive at the time could have anticipated. The end of the age of dinosaurs did not arrive as a gentle transition. It came through a combination of forces that acted together, compressing what might otherwise have been a long drawn-out change into a relatively short span of geological time. From the perspective of the planet's deep history, this moment was brief, but for the living world, it was decisive. One of the central pieces of this story lies far beyond the surface of the Earth, in the space that surrounds it. Sometime around 66 million years ago, a large object, likely an asteroid several kilometers wide, crossed paths with the planet. Its trajectory brought it into a collision course with what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico. The energy released by this impact was immense, far beyond anything produced by volcanic eruptions or earthquakes in recorded human history. When the object struck, it did not simply leave a hole in the ground. It vaporized rock, water, and living material in an instant. A massive crater formed, now known as the Chicxulub crater, buried beneath layers of sediment and partially hidden by the sea. The impact sent shock waves through the Earth's crust, triggering earthquakes and landslides across wide areas. Material ejected from the impact site was hurled high into the atmosphere and even beyond it, briefly entering space before falling back toward the surface. As this debris re-entered the atmosphere, it heated the air, creating a wave of intense heat that spread across large parts of the planet. This alone would have been devastating to many forms of life, especially those exposed on the surface. The immediate aftermath of the impact was marked by darkness. Dust, ash, and tiny particles of rock filled the atmosphere, blocking sunlight. This was not a brief eclipse that passed in minutes or hours. The haze persisted for months or even years, depending on location and conditions. With sunlight reduced, temperatures dropped. Photosynthesis slowed or stopped in many regions, disrupting the foundation of food webs on land and in the oceans. Plants, which rely on light to produce energy, were among the first to be affected. Without sufficient sunlight, growth faltered. Leaves fell. Some plants died outright. Others survived by drawing on stored resources, but even these reserves could only last so long. As plant communities declined, the animals that depended on them for food faced increasing scarcity. Herbivorous dinosaurs, many of which required large amounts of vegetation to sustain their massive bodies, were particularly vulnerable. As their food sources disappeared, their populations dwindled. Predators, in turn, found it harder to locate prey. The collapse of one level of the food web rippled upward and downward, affecting nearly every part of the system. The oceans experienced their own version of this disruption. Plankton, the microscopic organisms that form the base of marine food chains, depend on sunlight to grow. With light levels reduced, plankton populations dropped in many areas. This decline affected fish, marine reptiles, and other ocean dwellers that relied on them, directly or indirectly, for food. At the same time, the impact may have triggered or intensified volcanic activity in some regions, adding more gases and particles to the atmosphere. The combined effects of impact debris and volcanic emissions created a complex mix of warming and cooling influences, but the overall result was a period of environmental stress that extended across the globe. Weather patterns shifted as well. Changes in temperature and sunlight altered wind and rainfall. Some areas may have experienced increased storms, while others became drier. These variations added to the challenges faced by already stressed ecosystems. The idea of the sky falling silent is not just about the absence of familiar sounds. It also reflects a broader quieting of activity. As food became scarce and conditions grew harsher, many animals became less active. Populations shrank. In some regions, entire communities of species disappeared. Not all life was affected in the same way. Size and lifestyle played important roles in determining which organisms survived. Smaller animals, including early mammals, birds, and many reptiles, often required less food and could make use of a wider range of resources. Burrowing animals could shelter from some of the immediate effects of the impact and the changing climate. Those with flexible diets had more options when their usual food sources declined. Birds, which are the living descendants of feathered dinosaurs, showed a mix of vulnerability and resilience. Many bird lineages likely disappeared during this time, but some survived and later diversified, filling ecological roles left vacant by the extinction of larger animals. Plants too showed varied responses. While many species suffered, others were able to recover more quickly. Seeds buried in the soil could remain dormant until conditions improved. Fast-growing plants could take advantage of open spaces created by the loss of established vegetation. The fossil record captures this period as a sharp boundary. Below a certain layer of rock, dinosaur fossils are common. Above it, they are absent, except for the birds that continue into the present. This boundary is often marked by a thin layer rich in the element iridium, which is rare on the Earth's surface but common in asteroids. This layer serves as a chemical signature of the impact event. The changes were not limited to land and sea. The atmosphere itself was altered. The mix of gases and particles influenced how heat and light moved around the planet. Over time, as dust settled and chemical reactions ran their course, conditions gradually stabilized. Sunlight returned. Temperatures began to rise toward more typical levels. Recovery was not immediate. The world that emerged after this period of disruption was different in many ways from the one that had come before. The loss of large dinosaurs created opportunities for other groups to expand. Mammals, which had spent much of the Mesozoic living in the background, began to diversify and increase in size and number. Plant communities also changed. The continued spread of flowering plants, combined with the absence of some of the large herbivores that had shaped vegetation patterns, led to new kinds of landscapes. Forests, shrublands, and early grass-dominated areas began to develop in different regions. In the oceans, new groups of fish and marine mammals eventually rose to prominence, filling roles once held by marine reptiles. Coral reefs recovered and expanded in some areas, creating fresh habitats for a wide range of species. The extinction event at the end of the Mesozoic is often described as sudden, but its effects played out over a longer span of time. The immediate impact and its aftermath caused a rapid decline in many species. The longer-term recovery and reorganization of ecosystems took millions of years. This period highlights the vulnerability and resilience of life. Even a planet with complex, well-established ecosystems can be reshaped by a single, powerful event. At the same time, life's ability to persist and adapt ensures that new forms and patterns emerge, even after profound loss. The idea of silence in this context can be seen as a pause rather than a permanent absence. The familiar sounds of large dinosaurs moving through forests and plains faded, but other sounds took their place. The calls of birds, the movements of mammals, and the activity of insects became more prominent in the new world that followed. The landscape itself bore the marks of this transition. Impact debris and altered rock layers became part of the geological record. Changes in soil composition and plant cover influenced how rivers flowed and how coastlines developed. The physical shape of the planet continued to evolve, just as it always had. Looking at this moment from a broad perspective, it stands as a reminder that dominance in the natural world is not permanent. Groups that thrive for tens of millions of years can still be vulnerable to sudden changes in their environment. The success of dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic did not guarantee their survival through this particular combination of events. The connection between this extinction and the rise of mammals is often emphasized, but it is important to remember that many other groups were also affected. Plants, insects, marine organisms, and birds all went through periods of loss and recovery. The new world that emerged was the result of many different lineages responding to the same set of challenges in different ways. The sky, which had once been filled with pterosaurs and early birds, became quieter in some regions, then gradually more active again as surviving bird species spread and diversified. The ground, once dominated by massive herbivores and predators, became a place where smaller animals could move more freely and explore new roles. The memory of this event is written into the rocks, the fossils, and the chemistry of the Earth itself. Each layer of sediment tells part of the story, from the moment of impact to the slow return of sunlight and the gradual rebuilding of ecosystems. There is something both stark and instructive about this chapter in the planet's history. It shows how quickly conditions can change and how deeply those changes can reach. It also shows how life, given time, finds ways to continue. The age of dinosaurs, in the sense of a world dominated by large non-avian forms, came to an end. Yet dinosaurs did not vanish entirely. Birds, their feathered descendants, carried forward a piece of that ancient lineage, filling the skies with new shapes and sounds. The silence that followed the impact was not absolute or eternal. It was a transition, a clearing of space for new stories to begin. The world that emerged was not a simple continuation of what had been, but a different arrangement of familiar elements shaped by loss, survival, and change. As the dust settled and the light returned, the planet moved into another phase of its long history. Forests regrew, rivers found new paths, animals explored newly available niches. The breath of the earth continued, drawing in and releasing air, water, and energy in its steady ongoing cycle. Long after the dust of deep time has settled into stone and memory, traces of the Mesozoic still move quietly through the world around you, often in ways that are easy to miss. You do not need to stand beside a towering cliff, or hold a fossil in your hand to feel this connection. It can be found in the curve of a bird's wing as it passes overhead, in the pattern of leaves on a flowering plant, or in the steady rhythm of your own breathing as you rest and listen. The idea that the ancient world has vanished completely is a comfortable one, but it is not entirely true. The landscapes, climates, and living things of today are built on the foundations laid during those distant ages. Every layer of soil beneath your feet holds the remains of earlier worlds, compressed and transformed, carrying forward the minerals, carbon, and water that once moved through fern forests, shallow seas, and the bodies of long-gone animals. Consider the ground itself. The sand on a beach may include grains that were once part of a riverbed in the age of dinosaurs. The limestone in a hillside may have formed from the shells of marine creatures that lived in warm, shallow seas when continents were arranged very differently. These materials have been broken down, moved, and reassembled countless times, yet they still carry the imprint of their origins. The air you breathe also links you to that deep past. The oxygen in the atmosphere is, in part, a product of countless generations of plants, many of which trace their evolutionary roots back to the Mesozoic. The balance of gases that makes the planet comfortable for life is the result of long interactions between living organisms and the Earth's interior, a slow exchange that has been ongoing for hundreds of millions of years. Birds offer one of the most direct and visible connections. When you hear a call from a tree or see a shape crossing the sky, you're witnessing a living branch of a lineage that extends back to feathered dinosaurs. The bones, muscles, and even some behaviours of modern birds reflect adaptations that first appeared in that ancient world. Flight, in its many forms, is a gift carried forward through time, linking past and present in a single continuous motion. Plants tell a similar story. Flowering plants, which began their quiet spread during the later part of the Mesozoic, now cover much of the land. The fruits, seeds, and leaves that fill markets, gardens, and forests are the result of a long process of experimentation and partnership between plants and the animals that pollinate and disperse them. Each blossom, no matter how small, is part of a tradition that began millions of years ago. Even mammals, including humans, carry the marks of their early ancestors. The warm-blooded metabolism, the care given to young, the reliance on learning and memory, all have roots in those small hidden lives that unfolded beneath the shadows of dinosaurs. The success of mammals in the world that followed the Great Extinction was built on traits developed long before the giants disappeared. The shape of the continents you see on a map today also owes much to the movements that began during the Mesozoic. The opening of the Atlantic Ocean, the drifting apart of once connected lands, and the rise of mountain ranges were part of a slow rearrangement that continues even now. Each year, plates move by small amounts, adding up over time to changes that will reshape the planet's surface in the far future. Rivers follow paths carved by ancient processes. Some valleys were shaped by the flow of water over millions of years. Others reflect the lifting of land or the retreat of seas. The courses these rivers take influence where forests grow, where cities are built, and where people gather. In this way, decisions made by the Earth long before humans existed still guide the patterns of life today. The climate you experience is part of a system that has been evolving since the planet first developed an atmosphere and oceans. The balance between greenhouse gases, sunlight, and the circulation of air and water has shifted many times, producing warm periods, cooler intervals, and moments of rapid change. The Mesozoic stands as one example of how different the world can be under a different set of conditions, reminding us that the present state of the planet is not fixed or guaranteed. When you step outside in the evening, as the light softens and the sounds of the day begin to fade, you are entering a familiar scene that echoes the rhythms of deep time. Nightfall, with its cooling air and changing activity, has been a part of the planet's story for as long as it has rotated under the sun. The same stars, though in slightly different positions, watched over the forests, plains and seas of the Mesozoic. The moon too followed its steady path across the sky, influencing tides and the behaviour of living things. The pull of gravity that moves water along coastlines today also shaped the shallow seas and tidal flats where ancient animals fed and nested. This quiet, persistent force links the present moment to countless nights in the distant past. There is a comfort in recognising this continuity. While the details of life have changed dramatically, the broader patterns remain. Light and darkness, growth and decay, movement and stillness, all cycle through the world in familiar ways. The names and forms of the creatures involved may differ, but the underlying processes are the same. Modern ecosystems carry forward the layered complexity that developed over those ancient ages. Food webs connect plants, herbivores, predators, and decomposers in networks that mirror those of the Mesozoic, even if the players have changed. The flow of energy from sunlight to living tissue and back into the soil and air remains the foundation of life on land and in the sea. The idea of footprints is a useful way to think about this connection. A dinosaur track preserved in stone is a literal mark left behind by a passing animal. But there are also metaphorical footprints, traces of influence that persist in less obvious ways. The spread of flowering plants, the development of bird flight, the survival strategies of early mammals, all left impressions that shape the present. Human activity now adds its own layer to this long record. Cities, roads, and fields alter the surface of the planet, just as volcanic eruptions, shifting seas, and migrating herds did in the past. The scale and speed of these changes are different, but they become part of the same ongoing story of a planet in motion. Reflecting on this can bring a sense of perspective. The challenges and concerns of a single lifetime, or even of a single species, exist within a much larger framework. The Earth has seen forests rise and fall, oceans open and close, and entire groups of animals appear and disappear. Through it all, the planet continues its steady processes, creating new opportunities and new forms of life. This does not mean that individual moments are unimportant. On the contrary, every living thing experiences the world one day at a time. The daily routines of feeding, resting, exploring, and connecting are as meaningful now as they were in the deep past. The difference is that we can look back and see how these small actions, repeated across generations, contribute to much larger patterns. There is also a quiet invitation in this long view. It encourages patience, attention, and care. When you notice a bird building a nest, a plant pushing through a crack in the pavement, or the slow movement of clouds across the sky, you are witnessing expressions of a system that has been refining itself for hundreds of millions of years. The Mesozoic, with its vast timescales and dramatic changes, offers a reminder that the world is capable of both resilience and transformation. Life persisted through warming climates, shifting continents, volcanic eruptions, and even a planet-altering impact from space. The forms that survived and spread did so by adapting, cooperating, and finding new ways to fit into the changing environment. This perspective can bring a sense of quiet confidence. While the future is always uncertain, the long history of the Earth shows that change is a constant, and that new patterns can emerge from even the most disruptive events. The present moment is one point in a long chain, connected to what came before and influencing what will come after. As the evening deepens and the world around you settles into a slower pace, it can be comforting to imagine the countless nights that have passed on this planet. Nights when early mammals moved through undergrowth, when dinosaurs rested in open plains, when the first flowers released their scents into the dark, and when stars shone over oceans that covered parts of the land you now inhabit. The quiet of the present carries echoes of those earlier times. The breeze that moves through leaves, the distant call of an animal, the steady pulse of your own breath, all fit into patterns that have been repeating in one form or another since long before humans existed. There is no need to rush through this connection. It is not something to solve or complete. It is something to notice, to let sit gently in the background as you go about your own small, ordinary and meaningful routines. In this way, the story of the Mesozoic does not end with the last dinosaur or the settling of dust after a distant impact. It continues in the shape of the land, in the diversity of living things, and in the quiet moments when you pause and become aware of the world around you. The ancient footprints may be set in stone, but their influence moves through the present, guiding the flow of rivers, the growth of forests, and the paths of animals and people alike. Each step you take adds another layer to this ongoing record, another small mark in the long unfolding story of a planet that has been, and continues to be, alive with change. As the light fades and your own evening grows quieter, the sense of connection can remain, not as a grand conclusion, but as a gentle continuation, a reminder that the world you inhabit is part of a much larger journey, one that began long before and will carry on in new and unexpected ways long after this moment has passed.